The 14th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. I would like to remind members of the following mitigation measures that are in place for this meeting. All delegates are required to wear a face mask covering at all times whilst in public space and in General Assembly Hall, except when directly addressing the meeting. The size of a delegation should not exceed 4 delegates in the General Assembly Hall. We shall now continue the general debate. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of the Republic of India. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of the Republic of India. I invite him to address the General Assembly.
Namaskar साथियों.
Good morning, friends.
His Excellency Abdullah Shahid ji,
His Excellency Mr. Abdullah
आपको
Shahid.
अध्यक्ष पद संभालने की
First of all, I would like to
हार्दिक बधाई.
warmly congratulate you on
आपका अध्यक्ष
assuming
बनना
the office of President of the
सभी विकासशील
UNGA.
देशों
Your becoming President
और
is a
विशेषकर
matter of pride for all developing
small
countries
island developing
and
states के
in
लिए
particular for small island
गौरव की
developing
बात है.
states.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
गत 1.5 वर्ष से
for the last 1.5 years,
पूरा विश्व
the world
100 साल
has
में
been
आई सबसे
grappling with
बड़ी
the worst
महामारी
pandemic
का
it has
सामना
seen
कर
in
रहा है.
100 years.
ऐसी भयंकर महामारी में
I pay tribute
जीवन
to
गंवाने
all
वाले
those who have lost their lives
सभी लोगों
in
को
the deadly corona
मैं
pandemic,
श्रद्धांजलि देता हूं और
and
परिवारों
I
के साथ
express my condolences
संवेदनाएं व्यक्त
to
करता
their
हूं.
families.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
मैं उस देश का
I
प्रतिनिधित्व कर रहा
represent a
हूं
country
जिसे
that
मदर
is
ऑफ डेमोक्रेसी
proud
का
to be
गौरव
known
हासिल.
as the mother of democracy.
लोकतंत्र की हमारी
We have
हजारों
had
वर्षों की
a
महान
great
परंपरा
tradition
रही.
of democracy that goes back thousands of
इस
years.
15 अगस्त को
On 15th of
भारत ने
August this year,
अपनी आजादी के
India entered
75वें
the
साल में प्रवेश
75th
किया.
year of its independence.
हमारी विविधता
Our diversity
हमारे सशक्त लोकतंत्र
is
की
the
पहचान है.
identity of our strong
एक ऐसा
democracy.
देश
It is a country
जिसमें
that has
दर्जनों भाषाएं
dozens
हैं,
of languages,
सैकड़ों बोलियां हैं,
hundreds of dialects,
अलग अलग रहन सहन
different
खान पान.
lifestyles and cuisines.
ये वाइब्रेंट
This is
डेमोक्रेसी
the
का
best
बेहतरीन
example of a
उदाहरण है.
vibrant democracy.
ये भारत के लोकतंत्र की ताकत है.
The strength of our
एक
democracy
छोटा बच्चा
is demonstrated
जो
by the
कभी
fact that a little
एक
boy
रेलवे स्टेशन
who
के
at
टी
one
स्टॉल
time
पर
used to help
अपने
his
पिता
father
की मदद
at
करता
his tea
था,
stall at the
वो
railway
आज
station is today
चौथी बार
addressing the
भारत के
United
प्रधानमंत्री के तौर
Nations
पर
General Assembly for the 4th time
UNGA को
as
संबोधित
Prime
कर रहा
Minister
है.
of India.
सबसे लंबे समय तक
I will soon
गुजरात
have
का
spent 20
मुख्यमंत्री
years serving
और
my
फिर
countrymen as
पिछले
head of
7 साल
government.
से
First as the
भारत
longest
के
serving
प्रधानमंत्री
Chief
के
Minister
तौर पर
of
मुझे
Gujarat and then
Head of
as
Government
Prime
की
Minister
भूमिका में
for the last 7 years.
देशवासियों की सेवा करते हुए 20 साल हो रहे हैं और
And
मैं अपने
I
अनुभव
am
से कह
saying
रहा
this to
हूं,
you from my own
Yes.
experience. Yes,
डेमोक्रेसी कैन डिलीवर.
democracy can deliver.
यस,
Yes,
democracy
has delivered.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
एकात्म मानव दर्शन के
today is
प्रणेता
the birth anniversary
पंडित
of
दीनदयाल उपाध्याय जी की आज जन्म जयंती है।
Upadhyay, the proponent of Ekatma Manav Darshan.
एकात्म मानव दर्शन यानी
Ekatma Manav Darshan
इंटीग्रल
means
ह्यूमनिज्म,
integral humanism,
अर्थात
or
स्व से
the development
समष्टि
journey
तक
undertaken
विकास और
together,
विस्तार
the
की
expansion
सहयात्रा,
from the self to the universe,
expansion of the self,
expansion of the self,
moving from
moving
individual to
from
the
the
society,
individual to society,
the nation
to the nation,
and entire
and
humanity.
to entire humanity.
और ये चिंतन
And this philosophy
अंत्योदय को
is
समर्पित है।
dedicated to Antyodaya.
अंत्योदय को आज की परिभाषा
The
में
modern day
where
definition
no one
of
is left behind कहा
Antyodaya
जाता है।
is where no one is left
इसी भावना
behind.
के साथ
It is with this principle
आज
in mind that India
integrated,
today is moving
equitable
forward on the path of
डेवलपमेंट की राह पर आगे बढ़
integrated,
रहा है।
equitable development.
विकास
Our priority is
सर्वसमावेशी हो,
that development should be all-inclusive,
सर्वस्पर्शी हो,
all-pervasive,
सर्वव्यापी हो,
universal,
सर्वपोषक
and
हो।
one that nurtures all.
यही हमारी प्राथमिकता है। बीते 7 वर्षों में
During the last 7 years,
भारत में
India has
43
brought
करोड़
over
से ज्यादा लोगों को
430 million people
बैंकिंग
who
व्यवस्था
were
से जोड़ा
previously
गया है,
unbanked into
जो
the
अब
banking
तक
system.
इससे वंचित थे। आज
Today,
36
over
करोड़ से अधिक ऐसे लोगों को भी
360 million people
बीमा सुरक्षा
who
कवच मिला है,
earlier could
जो
not
पहले
even imagine
इस बारे में
this
सोच
was
भी नहीं
possible, now have insurance coverage
50
as
करोड़ से
security
ज्यादा लोगों को
by giving over 500
मुफ्त इलाज
million
की
people
सुविधा देकर
the facility of free
भारत ने
treatment in hospitals.
उन्हें क्वालिटी
India
हेल्थ
has
सर्विस से
given them
जोड़ा।
access to quality health
भारत ने
services
3 करोड़
by
पक्के घर
building
बनाकर
30 million
बेघर,
proper homes.
यानी
India has made
होमलेस परिवारों को
homeless families
होम ओनर्स बनाया।
homeowners.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
प्रदूषित पानी
polluted water
भारत ही नहीं
is a very big
पूरे
problem,
विश्व
not just for
और
India,
खासकर
but for the entire
गरीब और
world, and
विकासशील
in
देशों
particular
की
for poor and
बहुत
developing
बड़ी
countries.
समस्या है। भारत में इस चुनौती से निपटने के लिए
In order to address this
हम
challenge
17
in
करोड़ से
India,
अधिक घरों
we
तक
are carrying out a very big
पाइप से
campaign to ensure
साफ
that
पानी
piped
पहुंचाने का
clean
बहुत
water
बड़ा अभियान
reaches
चला रहे
over 170 million
विश्व
homes.
की बड़ी-बड़ी संस्थाओं ने
Reputed institutions of the
ये
world
माना है
have
कि
said
किसी भी
that
देश
for
के
the
विकास के
development
लिए
of any country,
वहाँ के नागरिकों के
people
पास
must have
जमीन
property rights
और
to
घर के
their home and
प्रॉपर्टी
land.
राइट्स यानी ओनरशिप
That
का
is,
रिकॉर्ड होना बहुत
ownership
जरूरी है।
records are a must.
दुनिया के बड़े-बड़े देशों
In
में
the most developed
बड़ी
countries,
संख्या में ऐसे
there
लोग
are a
हैं
large number of
जिनके
people
पास
who do not have
जमीनों
property
और घरों
rights
के
to their land and
प्रॉपर्टी
homes.
राइट्स नहीं है। आज हम
Today,
भारत
we
के
are using
6 लाख से
drones
अधिक गांवों
in
में
India to map over
ड्रोन से
600,000 villages.
मैपिंग कराकर
And
करोड़ों
by
लोगों
doing
को
so, we are
उनके
giving
घर
people there
और
digital
जमीन का
records of their
डिजिटल
homes
रिकॉर्ड
and
देने में
land.
जुटे हैं। ये डिजिटल रिकॉर्ड
These digital records
प्रॉपर्टी पर विवाद
not only
कम करने के
reduce
साथ ही
property disputes,
एक्सेस टू क्रेडिट
but will also give people
बैंक लोन तक
increased access to
लोगों की
credit
पहुंच बढ़ा रहा
and
है।
bank loans.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
आज विश्व का
today
हर छठा
every
व्यक्ति
sixth person in the
भारतीय
world
है।
is Indian.
जब भारतीयों की प्रगति होती
When
है
Indians make progress,
तो विश्व के विकास
it
को भी
also
गति
gives
मिलती
an
है।
impetus to the development of the world.
When India grows,
When India
the
grows,
world grows.
the world grows.
When India reforms,
When India
the
reforms,
world transforms.
the world transforms.
भारत में हो रहे
The
Science और technology
and
आधारित
technology-based innovations taking place in
विश्व की
India
बहुत मदद कर
can
सकते
make
हैं।
a big contribution to the world.
हमारे टेक सॉल्यूशंस का
The
स्केल
scalability of
और
our
उनकी
tech
कम लागत
solutions and their cost
दोनों
effectiveness are both
अतुलनीय है।
unparalleled.
हमारे यूनिफाइड
Over
पेमेंट इंटरफेस
3.5 billion
UPI
transactions are taking
आज
place every month
भारत
in
में
India
हर
through
महीने
our unified payment interface
350 करोड़ से
UPI.
ज्यादा ट्रांजैक्शन हो रहे हैं। भारत का वैक्सीन डिलीवरी
India's
प्लेटफॉर्म
vaccine delivery platform, CoWIN,
एक ही दिन में
offers digital support
करोड़ों वैक्सीन डोज
to
लगाने के लिए
register the administration
डिजिटल
of
सपोर्ट दे
millions
रहा
of
है।
vaccine doses in a
अध्यक्ष
single
महोदय,
day. Mr. President,
सेवा परमो धर्मः,
the India that puts into practice
सेवा परमो
the
धर्मः को जीने वाला
principle
भारत
of Seva Parmo Dharma,
सीमित
which means
संसाधनों के
service is
बावजूद
the
भी
highest religion, is today putting
vaccination
all
development
efforts into vaccine
और
development
manufacturing में
and manufacturing
जी जान से जुटा।
despite its limited resources.
मैं UNGA
I
को
would like to
ये
inform
जानकारी देना
the
चाहता हूं
UNGA
कि भारत
that
ने
India
दुनिया
has
की
developed
पहली
the world's first
दुनिया की पहली
the
डीएनए
world's
वैक्सीन
first DNA
विकसित कर ली है,
vaccine,
जिसे
and this vaccine
12 साल
can
की
be
आयु से ज्यादा के
administered to
सभी लोगों
anyone
को
above the age of
लगाया जा
12.
सकता है। एक और
Another vaccine,
mRNA वैक्सीन
an mRNA
अपने
vaccine,
डेवलपमेंट के
is
आखिरी
in
चरण
the
में
final stages of development.
भारत के वैज्ञानिक
Indian
कोरोना
scientists
की
are
एक
also
नेजल वैक्सीन
working
के निर्माण में
on
भी
the
जुटे हैं।
development of a nasal vaccine for the
मानवता के प्रति
coronavirus.
अपने दायित्व को
Deeply
समझते हुए
conscious of its
भारत ने
responsibility
एक बार
towards
फिर
mankind, India
दुनिया के
has
जरूरतमंदों को
resumed the process of
वैक्सीन
providing
देनी शुरू कर दी।
vaccines to those who need it in the world.
मैं आज
Today,
दुनिया भर के
I
वैक्सीन
also
मैन्युफैक्चरर्स
extend
को भी
an invitation
आमंत्रित
to
करता हूं।
vaccine
कम
manufacturers from across the
Come.
world. Come,
मेक वैक्सीन इन इंडिया।
make vaccine in India.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
आज हम सब जानते हैं
all of us,
कि मानव जीवन में
how important
टेक्नोलॉजी का कितना
technology
महत्व
is
है,
in the lives of people today.
लेकिन बदलते हुए
However,
विश्व में
In this ever-changing world,
टेक्नोलॉजी
it is equally
with
important
democratic
to
values
ensure technology
ये सुनिश्चित
with
करना भी
democratic
आवश्यक है।
values.
भारतीय मूल के
No
डॉक्टर,
matter which
इनोवेटर,
country, the doctors,
engineers,
innovators,
मैनेजर
engineers, and
किसी भी देश
managers
में रहें,
of Indian origin live in
हमारे
our
लोकतांत्रिक मूल्य
democratic values
उन्हें
inspire
मानवता
them
की सेवा
to
में
continue
जुटे रहने
serving
की प्रेरणा
mankind.
देते रहते हैं। और ये हमने
And
इस
this
कोरोना काल में भी
is the
देखा।
spirit that we have
अध्यक्ष
indeed
महोदय,
seen during the corona
कोरोना
pandemic
महामारी ने
also. Mr.
विश्व
President,
को ये भी
the
सबक दिया
corona
है
pandemic has also taught
वैश्विक
another important
अर्थव्यवस्था
lesson
को
to the world that
अब और
the global
अधिक डाइवर्सिफाई
economy
किया
needs to be
जाए।
diversified even further.
इसके लिए
And for this,
ग्लोबल वैल्यू चेन्स का
expansion
विस्तार
of
आवश्यक है।
global value chains is necessary.
हमारा आत्मनिर्भर भारत
Our
अभियान
Atmanirbhar Bharat or
इसी भावना
self-reliant
से
India
प्रेरित है।
movement is inspired by this
Global
very spirit.
इंडस्ट्रियल डाइवर्सिफिकेशन के लिए
Is becoming
भारत
a
विश्व
democratic
का एक
and
लोकतांत्रिक
reliable partner
और
for
भरोसेमंद
global
पार्टनर
industrial
बन रहा है।
diversification.
और इस अभियान में
And in this
भारत
movement,
ने
India
इकोनॉमी
has struck
और इकोलॉजी
better balance
दोनों में
between both economy
बेहतर संतुलन
and
स्थापित किया
ecology.
है। बड़े और विकसित देशों की तुलना में
I'm sure
क्लाइमेट
that
एक्शन को
you
लेकर
all also feel proud
भारत
of
के
the
प्रयासों
efforts
को
made
देखकर
by India
आप
with regard
सभी
to
को
climate change
निश्चित
compared
ही
to
गर्व
those
होगा।
made by big and
आज
developed
भारत
nations. Today,
बहुत तेजी के
India is
साथ
moving forward with
450
great speed
gigawatt
towards its target of
renewable energy
450
के लक्ष्य की तरफ बढ़
gigawatts
रहा है।
of renewable energy.
हम भारत को
We
दुनिया
have
का
also
सबसे बड़ा
started work on making
ग्रीन
India the
हाइड्रोजन
world's
हब बनाने के
largest
अभियान में भी
green hydrogen
जुट गए।
hub.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
हमें अपनी
we
आने
are
वाली पीढ़ियों को
answerable to our future generations
जवाब देना है कि जब
when they ask
फैसले लेने का
when
समय
it
था
was time to take decisions.
तब
What were those people
जिन पर
doing? Those
विश्व
people
को दिशा
whose
देने का दायित्व
responsibility
था
it was to give
वो
direction
क्या कर
to
रहे
the
थे।
world.
आज
Today,
विश्व के सामने
the world is facing
रिग्रेसिव
an
थिंकिंग
increased threat
और
of
एक्सट्रीमिज्म का
regressive thinking and
खतरा बढ़ता जा
extremism.
रहा है। इन परिस्थितियों में
In such a
पूरे
situation,
विश्व को
the entire
Science-based,
world must
rational
make
और
science-based,
progressive
rational
thinking को
and progressive thinking
विकास का
the
आधार
basis
बनाना
for
ही होगा।
development.
साइंस बेस्ड अप्रोच को
In
मजबूत
order
करने के
to
लिए
strengthen a science-based
भारत
approach, India
एक्सपीरियंस
is
बेस्ड
promoting
लर्निंग को बढ़ावा दे रहा है।
experience-based learning.
हमारे यहाँ
In
स्कूलों
India,
में
in
हजारों
schools, thousands
अटल
of
टिंकरिंग
adult
लैब खोली
tinkering
गई है।
labs have been set up.
इंक्यूबेटर्स बने हैं
We have also
और
set up incubators
एक मजबूत
and a
स्टार्टअप
strong
इकोसिस्टम
startup
विकसित हुआ।
ecosystem has been developed.
अपनी आजादी के 75 वर्ष के उपलक्ष्य में
On the occasion of the
जब हम
75th
आजादी
year
का अमृत
of its
महोत्सव मना रहे हैं,
independence, when we are celebrating the
भारत
Azadi Ka Amrit Festival,
75 ऐसे
India
सैटेलाइट्स को
is
अंतरिक्ष
going
में
to
भेजने वाला है
launch 75
जो
satellites
भारतीय
into
विद्यार्थी
space that
स्कूल
are being
कॉलेजों में
made
बना
by
रहे हैं।
Indian students in schools and
अध्यक्ष जी,
colleges. Mr. President,
दूसरी ओर
on the other hand,
रिग्रेसिव थिंकिंग के साथ
countries with
जो
regressive
देश
thinking
आतंकवाद
that
का
are using terrorism
पॉलिटिकल
as
टूल
a
के रूप में
political
इस्तेमाल
tool,
कर रहे हैं,
these
उन्हें
countries
ये
must
समझना होगा
understand
कि
that
आतंकवाद
terrorism is
उनके
an
लिए भी
equally
उतना ही
big
बड़ा
threat
खतरा
for
है।
them also.
ये सुनिश्चित किया जाना बहुत
It
जरूरी
is
है
absolutely essential
कि अफगानिस्तान
ensure
की धरती का
that
इस्तेमाल
Afghanistan's territory
आतंकवाद
is
फैलाने
not used
और
to spread
आतंकी हमलों के लिए
terrorism
न हो।
and for terrorist attacks.
हमें इस बात के लिए भी
We also
हमें इस बात के लिए
need
भी सतर्क रहना
to be
होगा
alert
कि वहाँ
and
की
ensure
नाजुक स्थितियों का कोई
that
देश
no country
अपने
tries to
स्वार्थ के
take
लिए
advantage of
एक
the
tool
delicate
की तरह
situation there and
इस्तेमाल
use it as
करने
a
की
tool
कोशिश न
for
करें।
its own selfish interests.
इस समय
At this time,
अफगानिस्तान की
the
जनता
people of Afghanistan,
वहाँ की महिलाओं
the women
और बच्चों को
and children
वहाँ की
of
माइनॉरिटीज
Afghanistan,
को
the minorities of
मदद की
Afghanistan
जरूरत है
need help,
और इसमें
and
हमें
we
अपना
must
दायित्व निभाना
fulfill
ही
our
होगा।
duty by providing them
अध्यक्ष
with this
महोदय,
help. Mr. President,
हमारे समंदर भी
our oceans,
हमारी साझी
our
विरासत,
oceans are also our shared
इसलिए
heritage, and that is
हमें ये
why
ध्यान रखना होगा
we must keep in mind
कि ओशन
that
रिसोर्सेज
we
को
must only
हम यूज करें,
use ocean resources
नहीं।
and not abuse them.
हमारे समंदर
Further, our oceans
अंतरराष्ट्रीय व्यापार की
are
लाइफलाइन
also
भी है।
the lifeline of international
इन्हें
trade.
हमें
We must
एक्सपांशन
protect them
और
from the
एक्सक्लूजन
race
की दौड़
for
से बचाकर
expansion
रखना होगा।
and exclusion.
रूल बेस्ड वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर को सशक्त करने
The
के लिए
international community must
अंतरराष्ट्रीय
speak
समुदाय
in
को
one voice to
एक
strengthen
सूर में
a rule-based
आवाज उठानी
world
ही होगी।
order.
सुरक्षा परिषद में
The broad consensus
भारत की प्रेसिडेंसी के
reached
दौरान
in the Security
बड़ी
Council
विस्तृत सहमति
during India's presidency
विश्व को
shows to the world
मैरीटाइम सिक्योरिटी के
the way
विषय में
forward
आगे
for
बढ़ने का मार्ग
maritime
दिखाती है।
security.
अध्यक्ष महोदय,
Mr. President,
भारत के
the
महान
great
कूटनीतिज्ञ
diplomat of India,
आचार्य चाणक्य
Acharya
ने
Chanakya,
सदियों पहले
said
कहा था,
this
कालाति
hundreds of years ago. Kalati
क्रमात्
Kal
काल
eva
एव फलं
phalam
पिबति।
pibati.
जब सही
When
समय पर सही
The
कार्य
right
नहीं किया
action is
जाता,
not taken at the
तो
right
समय
time,
ही
then it is
उस
time
कार्य
itself
की सफलता को
that causes
समाप्त कर देता
the
है।
action to fail.
संयुक्त राष्ट्र
If
को खुद को
the United Nations
प्रासंगिक बनाए रखना
wants to
है,
remain
तो
relevant,
उसे
it will need
अपनी
to
इफेक्टिवनेस को
improve
सुधारना
its
होगा,
effectiveness and
रिलायबिलिटी को बढ़ाना होगा।
enhance its reliability.
यूएन पर आज कई तरह के
Today,
सवाल खड़े हो रहे हैं।
all kinds of questions are being
इन
raised
सवाल को
about the UN.
हमने
We have seen
Climate
such
crisis में
questions
देखा
being
है,
raised related to
कोविड
the
के
climate
दौरान देखा है,
crisis, and we also
दुनिया
saw
के
them
कई
during
हिस्सों में
COVID.
चल रही प्रॉक्सी
The
वॉर,
proxy war going
आतंकवाद
on in
और
many
अभी
parts of the world,
अफगानिस्तान के
terrorism,
संकट ने
and the recent
इन
Afghan
सवालों को
crisis
और
have
गहरा
further
कर दिया।
highlighted the seriousness of these questions.
कोविड के ओरिजिन के संदर्भ
With
में
regard to the origin
और
of COVID,
ईज
or
ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस रैंकिंग को
regarding
लेकर
the ease of doing business ranking,
वैश्विक गवर्नेंस से जुड़ी संस्थाओं
institutions
ने
of global governance
दशकों के परिश्रम से
have
बनी अपनी
damaged
विश्वसनीयता
the
को
credibility they
नुकसान
had
पहुंचाया
built,
है।
which was a result of
ये आवश्यक
decades
है
of hard work.
कि हम
It is essential
यूएन को
that
ग्लोबल
we
ऑर्डर,
constantly strengthen the
ग्लोबल
UN
लॉज
in order to
और
safeguard
ग्लोबल
global
वैल्यूज के
order,
संरक्षण के लिए
global laws
निरंतर सुदृढ़
and
करें।
global values.
मैं नोबेल पुरस्कार विजेता
I would like to end
गुरुदेव
my address
रविंद्रनाथ
with the
टैगोर जी
words
के
of the Nobel
शब्दों के
laureate
साथ
Gurudev
अपनी बात
Rabindranath
समाप्त कर रहा हूं।
Tagore.
शुभो कर्म
Shubho
पोथे,
Kormopothe,
शुभो
Shubho
Kormopothe,
Kormopothe,
ধোরো নির্ভয়োগান,
Dhoro Nirbhayogan,
সব দুর্বল
Shob
Shonyos,
Durbol, Shonyosh,
Hok Aboshan,
Aboshan,
अर्थात
which means
अपने शुभ कर्म पथ पर
boldly proceed
निर्भीक होकर
on
आगे
your
बढ़ो।
path of good deeds.
सभी दुर्बलताएं
May you
और
overcome
शंकाएं
all
समाप्त हो।
weaknesses and doubts.
ये संदेश आज के संदर्भ में
In the context of the current
संयुक्त
times,
राष्ट्र के लिए
this
जितना
message is
प्रासंगिक
as
है,
relevant
उतना
to
ही
every responsible
हर
nation
जिम्मेदार
as it
देश के
is
लिए भी
to the United Nations.
उतना ही प्रासंगिक। मुझे विश्वास है
I'm confident
हम सबका प्रयास
that our efforts
विश्व में
will enhance
शांति और
peace
सौहार्द
and
बढ़ाएगा,
harmony in the world
विश्व को
and will
स्वस्थ,
make the world
सुरक्षित और
healthy,
समृद्ध बनाएगा।
safe, and
इन्हीं
prosperous.
शुभकामनाओं के
With
साथ
these good wishes,
बहुत बहुत
I
धन्यवाद।
thank you all.
नमस्कार।
Namaskar.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Republic of India for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Lucia to introduce an address by the head of government.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency, the Honorable Philip J. Pierre, Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Development, and the Youth Economy of St. Lucia.
Mr. President, colleague heads of government and foreign ministers, country representatives, and members of country delegations, I bring you warm greetings from the most beautiful piece of territory on earth, the sovereign state of St. Lucia. Mr. President, I'm honored to address this body for the first time as the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. It was my privilege to lead my party in the general elections less than 2 months ago, and to have witnessed the people of my country continue to uphold and nurture the deep democratic traditions of our Caribbean by giving my party an overwhelming mandate to govern St. Lucia for the next 5 years. I wish to pledge to the international community that under my leadership, St. Lucia's intention to uphold the highest traditions of universal brotherhood, the pursuit of mutually beneficial goals, respect for all peoples and cultures, and the recognition and respect of the sovereignty of all member states of the United Nations. Mr. President, permit me to join other colleagues in extending congratulations to you on your elevation to the presidency of this vital and crucial catalyst of global development, the United Nations General Assembly. It is our sincere hope and our profound expectation that your tenure will be marked by thoughtful and tangible action given the global challenges that confront us as UN member states, and given that our very lives and continued existence as peoples and as a planet are directly threatened by the issues now confronting us. St. Lucia joined the United Nations in 1979. We have always prided ourselves on our principled positions in matters of foreign policy. If there were any recent doubts about St. Lucia's adherence to these basic principles, I am here to reassure you that St. Lucia subscribes fully to and stands firmly on the principles of non-interference in the internal politics of nations. In pursuit of our sustainable development goals, we shall be, in the words of Barbados' independence pioneer and late Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Errol Walton Barrow, friends of all but satellites of none. We shall, as much as possible, engage in foreign policy coordination with our CARICOM and OECS partners, and our relationship shall continue to be based on mutual respect. St. Lucia will not sacrifice these principles on the altar of convenience, short-term and temporary alliances with great powers whose shifting global stances may or may not coincide with St. Lucia's permanent existence on being a mutually respected regional developmental partner. Mr. President, I must confess that our excitement at the opportunity to sensitize the global community to St. Lucia's perspective on the issues before this respected body has been tempered by the frustrating realization that if I may borrow an idiom from one of my fellow CARICOM member states, we are spinning top in mud or we are going around in circles. I say this, Mr. President, because in pursuing the contribution delivered to this body by St. Lucia in 2015, I was struck by the similarity of the concerns raised then to the concerns confronting us today. In 2021, Mr. President, the dates, the names, and the faces have changed, but the issues remain the same. It is not my intention to question the modus operandi of this honorable institution, because the evidence confirming the good work of the United Nations is undeniable. However, Mr. President, St. Lucia cannot pretend to be unconcerned by the fact that small island developing state SIDS, like St. Lucia, continue to suffer from a number of challenges arising out of our smallness, our island existence, our vulnerability to natural disasters, and climate change. However, while we struggle to formulate solutions for these ills, we have been confronted with a novel coronavirus, COVID-19. While its novelty and evolving character is baffling, COVID-19 has enlarged and worsened the issues confronting SIDS. In this sense, Mr. President, we are now being inundated by the new while still being overwhelmed by the old. Mr. President, we continue to contend with the near impossible balancing act of preserving lives and livelihoods. The insidious nature of the virus has allowed it to sneak across even the most heavily patrolled borders, and St. Lucia has experienced waves of highs and lows in managing this pandemic. In that regard, we extend our deepest gratitude to international institutions such as the COVAX facility and our many bilateral partners such as India and the United States of America for their commitment in ensuring that we in St. Lucia and by extension the Caribbean region will not further disadvantaged by our inability to access vaccines. Mr. President, as we battle this pandemic, there is another global threat that runs parallel to it by the name of misinformation. The governor of St. Lucia has embarked upon a robust education program to encourage our population to get vaccinated, as realistically, this is the only way to reduce, eliminate, and eradicate the risk and restrictions caused by this pandemic and permit us to rebuild our economies and societies stronger. However, we have witnessed in dismay the politics at play, even in the midst of this pandemic, as various countries create their lists of recognized and unrecognized vaccines, with certain privileges awarded to global citizens who have opted for certain branded vaccines over others. We have witnessed vaccine apartheid in various forms, and not only in terms of production and distribution. Some countries which have stockpiled vaccines are now in the middle of debates about third doses and boosters, while other countries watch helplessly as COVID-19 related deaths continue to rise for want of a jab. Mr. President, in St. Lucia, we recognize all vaccines that are endorsed and administered by our country's respective government, as we have entrusted sovereign states with the responsibility of following the science. In this regard, we call for the standardization of vaccine privileges across the global community as it relates to quarantine, isolation, and other related requirements. St. Lucia, like many other countries, is grappling with a decline in investment, trade remittances, and a growing debt burdens. There is an urgent need to accelerate global momentum towards the ambitious targets across various international agreements and developmental agendas. A common thread across these instruments is the need to address the unique vulnerabilities and special circumstances of SIDS. St. Lucia and all SIDS continue to face huge spending needs to finance the immediate health responses that are well beyond our capacities. Such a shift in focus will reverse achievements in sustainable development goals, implementation, and in building climate resilience. Therefore, St. Lucia stands in solidarity with all SIDS in calling for an abolition of current classical economics criteria for accessing concessional development finance. These indicators erroneously paint a picture of national prosperity that lies in stark contrast to existing realities. Mr. President, St. Lucia is calling for the adoption of a global vulnerability index by international institutions. This index should include variables such as vulnerability to adverse weather systems and natural disasters, historical disadvantages arising out of plunder, colonization, and exploitation, and the vagaries of the economic activities which such states depend on for survival. Such a global vulnerability index will ensure that access to concessional development finance is granted based on the criteria that consider the true context of our fragile economies, which are constantly on the threat of regression due to natural, man-made, or political disasters. St. Lucia also calls for immediate measures to safeguard the solvency of SIDS, which have disproportionately affected during the pandemic. These measures must include debt restructuring and write-offs, support to strengthen health systems, more equitable distribution and access to vaccines, and assistance for recovery that meets the demands of the developmental model adopted in the beneficiary country and is consistent with our current socio-economic environment. Mr. President, the pandemic seems to have slowed down everything but the deterioration of our beloved planet Earth. Climate change continues to wreak havoc across all areas of the globe. While COVID-19 now grabs the headlines, it's a fact that the pandemic emerged at a time when the world was already on an unsustainable path towards a 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. With less than a decade left to achieve the 2030 agenda, the UN's decade of delivery requires urgent and adequate solutions towards salvaging our global living quarters. The resilience we need and the adaptations required system-wide to respond to COVID are directly relevant to the resilience and adaptation required for climate change. It can be argued that the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate change challenge confronts us with an intermeshed problem of symptom as cause and cause as symptom. It provides us a harsh and timely reminder that human health and planetary health are linked. Sadly, Mr. President, the cost of meeting these challenges and undertaking the resilience activities, whether it be for health or climate, is way beyond the financial reach of our small islands. We therefore appeal to all, especially those most able financially, to contribute towards our recovery efforts and to pay their commitments to the adaptation and mitigation funds so that SIDS can benefit. On the eve of COP26, we encourage the larger economies, the often major contributors to greenhouse gases, to honor their financial pledges. This will allow us, the smaller vulnerable economies whose contributions to greenhouse gases are often negligible, the fiscal room to build climate resilient societies. Mr. President, as we maneuver the turmoil of these unprecedented times, the young people must be brought into the mainstream of national development. Too often, the youth are placed on the back burner when things get rough and the belt used for economic tightening is strung around their very necks. Such an approach fails to consider the immense energy, enthusiasm, and creativity which young people bring to the developmental table. It is for this reason St. Lucia has prioritized the implementation of the youth economy as the new frontier of our economic development, formalized in a new government department under the purview of the Prime Minister, with the mandate of propelling our young people to turn their talents, skills, and hobbies into economic enterprises for their own empowerment. We see our young people as a resource to be molded and optimized, not as problems to be managed or solved. We believe that a country must consider the aspirations of its young citizens and turn them into concrete and practical assets, purposes, and goals. Mr. President, we are committed to improving the lives of our young people, especially the most vulnerable, and we are working with all citizens to assist them in transforming their lives and to make viable contributions to the economy. In this regard, St. Lucia invites the international community to discuss and engage with us strategically on mutual beneficial relationships and projects to promote the youth economy as we seek to build a better and more sustainable future for all. Mr. President, St. Lucia remains among a handful of countries which maintain official relations with the government of the Republic of Taiwan. We continue to plead the case to advance their cause to be acceptable as a legitimate participant in the global decision-making process. But, Mr. President, the development of St. Lucia will continue to be compromised as long as the development of our sister nation of Cuba continues to be frustrated by global political considerations. In this regard, Mr. President, St. Lucia encourages a revisiting of the chapter in history not too long ago, where diplomatic reconciliation had commenced between the United States of America and the Republic of Cuba under the Obama-Biden administration. In fact, then Vice President Biden was the chief envoy of the United States to Cuba, and it would be a signal achievement if, as president of the Biden-Harris administration, he were to bring his work on Cuba to its logical conclusion with the normalization of relations. Cuba continues to punch above its weight with its humanitarian efforts, playing its part in the global COVID-19 response despite its disadvantaged position in the international community. St. Lucia joins CARICOM and the global community in renewing calls for the United States to normalize its relations with Cuba and for the abolition of the existing embargo, which only serves as a hindrance to economic growth in Cuba and an obstacle to realizing full regional economic integration in the Caribbean. Given Cuba's role in health, education, sports, and social development in our region, the normalization of relations with Cuba means the advancement of development in our entire Caribbean region. And we make this annual call for the normalization of relations with Cuba. St. Lucia wants it to be known that we are speaking to our own development in as much as we are speaking about the betterment of the lives of the Cuban people. At a time when we are experiencing global turmoil, it is important for good sense to prevail and for the world to fully embrace the immense expertise and resources which the Cuban people have to offer. It is more than overdue for us to make right this grave injustice to Cuba that has deliberately cut them off from the global supply chain. The continuation of this embargo in 2021 is unconscionable. Mr. President, the situation in Venezuela concerns St. Lucia tremendously. As one of the first nations to establish diplomatic relations with St. Lucia after we gained independence in 1979, and as a beneficiary of Venezuelan economic cooperation, St. Lucia considers Venezuela a loyal and legitimate friend and partner. The virtual economic blockade which has been imposed on the democratically elected government of Venezuela by a few big and powerful countries is unacceptable in this international system. It is even more outrageous that the prominent members of this international system who pride themselves on their democratic traditions have sought to recognize an alternative president who did not even contest elections and who has no political legitimacy whatsoever. Further, the act of seizing and freezing Venezuelan government gold, cash and assets while preventing access by the Venezuelan people to basic food, medicines and supplies during this pandemic could quite conceivably qualify as modern-day piracy, economic terrorism and crimes against humanity. St. Lucia and CARICOM cannot in good conscience continue to be part of this unjust attack against the Venezuelan people. Mr. President, as I conclude, I again call for urgent consideration of the harsh reality and the many and continuing challenges confronted SIDS like St. Lucia. Mr. President, now is the time for change, the time to act, the time to overcome our challenges through global solidarity and mutual assistance. The future of every nation and country is at risk. We need the global economy to work for the 99% and not just the wealthy and powerful 1%. Mr. President, I appeal to the international community to remain focused on working in partnership with SIDS like St. Lucia for the balanced development of the global community. We need the powerful to behave responsibly and cooperate more effectively to enable a more inclusive and sustainable humanity for all and to ensure that no one is left behind. Caribbean countries like ours, which were exploited and underdeveloped to finance the development of Europe, have put forward a case for reparations for slavery and native genocide. And we expect that case to be treated with the seriousness and urgency it deserves. There should be no double standards in the international system in recognizing and acknowledging and compensating victims of crimes against humanity. And so, St. Lucia urges that the principles which have been applied to other victims of mass slavery and such forms of exploitation be applied with equal force and sincerity and seriousness of purpose to Caribbean nations who suffered more than 3 centuries of slavery and native genocide between 1492 and 1838 by the powers of Europe. St. Lucia fully endorses the stance of the CARICOM Reparations Commission that our reparations movement is a moral, legal, and political response to the crimes against humanity committed during the European imperial project, specifically the genocide against the native population and the trading and enslavement of enchained bodies of Africans. Mr. President, as one of our local laureates, Robert Lee, penned, St. Lucia is a state, not a real estate, not plantation estates. This is an open wound crying out for justice, healing, compassion, and closure, and it continues to fester with every decree or decision of the OECD on such other groupings. If the international system is to work fairly for all nations, wrong cannot continue to be strong, and might cannot continue to be right. Let us therefore return to our core principles of peace, harmony, fairness, tolerance, and non-interference in the internal politics of sovereign states. Let us be guided by the golden cord of mutual respect and universal fraternity, particularly in these perilous times which demand that we recognize our common humanity above anything else. Mr. President, I continue to believe in dialogue, inclusion, fairness, and a common humanity. St. Lucia is confident in the leadership of this august body, and St. Lucia is assured that under our joint effort, we can transform the words of the theme of our meeting into one lived reality, and we will successfully build resilience through hope to recover from COVID-19. We will rebuild sustainably by responding appropriately to the needs of the planet. We respect the rights of all peoples, and we will revitalize the United Nations so that it can reflect the highest, most noble principles upon which it was founded. Mr. President, I end with a verse from Love After Love by Nobel laureate and St. Lucian's son, Sir Derek Walcott. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome. We work towards this goal. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Development and Youth Economy of St. Lucia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Andorra to introduce an address by the head of government.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai l'honneur de présenter le message préenregistré de Son Excellence Monsieur Javier Espot Zamora, chef du gouvernement de la Principauté d'Andorre.
Senyor President, Senyor Secretari General, Excelències, Senyores i Senyors.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset I'd like to congratulate Mr. Abdullah Shahid for his election as President of the General Assembly, as well as His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres on his appointment for a second mandate to the post of Secretary General of the United Nations. This great assembly of all the peoples and for all the peoples, the main aim of which is to build a system of values and a code of conduct based on multilateralism multilateralism
Us
and
desitgem molts
cooperation.
encerts en aquest nou període,
We wish you
que
every
esperem que
success
estigui
during this
clarament
new
marcat per la
session, a
recuperació
session
social i
which we hope
econòmica,
will be
per
broadly
una recuperació
characterized by
més humana,
economic and
més
social
sostenible
recovery,
i
a more
arrelada en el
humane and
convenciment
sustainable
que la
recovery,
solidaritat és el
anchored in
valor
the
que hem de
conviction
posar
that
en les
solidarity
nostres
must be the
accions.
basis of our actions.
Vull enviar
Also
un
would like
missatge
to thank
d'agraïment
His
a Sa
Excellency Mr.
Excel·lència
Volkan
Volkan
Bozkir,
Bozkir,
who
que de forma
relentlessly
incansable
maintained
ha
the
mantingut
activity of
l'activitat de
the Assembly
l'Assemblea al
throughout
llarg
the
del
75th
75è
session.
període de sessions. El 2020 serà un dels
2020
anys
is one
més
of the years
recordats de
of
la nostra
our
història
contemporary history
contemporània
which will
perquè la
remain
crisi
in
sanitària
our
de la
memories.
Covid-19
The
ha sacsejat
COVID-19
els pilars de les
crisis has
nostres
shaken the
societats i ha
foundations of our
afectat
society
pràcticament tots
and
els
has had
àmbits de les nostres vides.
repercussions in
Avui
virtually
som
all
més conscients
areas.
que mai
Today,
de
more
la
than ever
immediatesa
before,
i
we
la
are aware
contundència amb
that
què el
our
nostre
present can
present pot
change and
canviar
our
i
future
de
can be
com
called
el
into
nostre
question
futur
in a
està.
way that is both immediate and
La pandèmia ha estat un dur
irreparable. This
recordatori
pandemic
de
has
les nostres
cruelly reminded us
fragilitats,
of our
de la manca
frailty
de
and
preparació
lack
per
of
fer front
preparation
a
in the
una crisi
faces of such a
d'aquesta magnitud.
crisis on such a scale.
La declaració amb
The
motiu de la
declaration
commemoració del
on the
75è
occasion of the
aniversari de les
commemoration of
Nacions
the
Unides
75th
deixava
anniversary of the
constància
United
que el nostre
Nations
món
underscored the
encara
fact
dista
that
molt
our
del que
world
van
is still a
idear els
long way
fundadors
away
d'aquest
from
gran
the
organisme.
goals set out by the
Sobre les
founders of
runes
this
del
great
conflicte bèl·lic
organization.
més devastador
The
de la
United
història
Nations was
van
built
néixer
on
les
the
Nacions Unides.
ruins of the most
Per
murderous
enviar un missatge de pau a tot el món
conflict
i
in
per fer
history,
front als
sending
reptes
out a
universals.
message of peace
I
to
van
take up
configurar
universal
també un marc
challenges, and for
institucional
this
que
to
ha
establish an
assolit importants
institutional
avenços
framework.
en àmbits
It
tan
accomplished great
transcendentals com els
progress
drets
in
humans,
areas as
l'erradicació de la
transcendental
pobresa,
as human
la
rights, the
consolidació
eradication of
d'institucions
poverty, the
democràtiques,
building of
la lluita
democratic
contra el canvi
institutions,
climàtic i el
the
desenvolupament
fight against
sostenible
climate
o
change,
la protecció de
sustainable
les persones
development,
més
and the
vulnerables en
protection of the
conflictes
most
armats.
vulnerable during armed
Però,
conflict.
malauradament, encara
Unfortunately,
queda un
the
llarg camí per
path
recórrer.
lying ahead is still a
Aquest
long
darrer any,
one.
els països
This year,
rics
the rich
hem fet
countries once
prevaldre
again
una
have
vegada més
insisted on
una
their
situació
privileged
privilegiada.
position.
Hem accedit més
We
ràpidament a
quickly
les
had
vacunes
access
i
to
n'hem acaparat
vaccines and
milions de
hoarded millions
dosis i
of
així hem
doses,
afavorit de nou
which has
les
deepened
desigualtats.
inequality.
A més, el món
The
ha tornat
world
a ser
again
testimoni de la
sees
fugida
entire
de
families
famílies
fleeing their
senceres dels
countries
seus
of
llocs d'origen
origin,
a la
looking for a
recerca d'un
better
futur millor,
future.
de
Humanitarian
l'agreujament de
crises
les
are
crisis
getting worse. The
humanitàries,
planet
de
is
l'alerta del
sounding the alarm
planeta
bell
perquè el
because
compte
the point
enrere
of
per frenar el canvi
non-return when it comes
climàtic
to the
aviat
climate
arribarà a
change
zero
will
o
soon
del
be
retrocés
achieved,
flagrant
or we
dels
see
drets de
the
les
rights of
dones.
women receding precipitously.
Senyor president, permeteu-me que us
Mr.
feliciti per
President,
la
allow me to
idoneïtat del lema
congratulate you
d'aquesta
on the relevance
76a
of the
Assemblea
subject
General,
of this
una
76th General
presidència
Assembly,
per a
the
l'esperança.
presidency of hope.
Esperança,
Hope.
perquè no tot està
Indeed,
perdut.
not all is lost.
No hem
We
d'aturar
must
els
pursue
esforços
our
per
efforts to
planificar
plan
i
and
oferir una
propose a
resposta que
response
faci albirar la
which will make it
recuperació
possible
d'aquells
to
països
relaunch
on
the
la
countries that
pandèmia
have been
ha
most
causat
ravaged by
més
the
efectes.
pandemic.
Una
A
resposta que
response
s'ha de
focused
fonamentar
on
en un
more sustainable and
desenvolupament més
inclusive
sostenible i
development
inclusiu,
which leaves no one
que no deixi
behind,
ningú
so
enrere
that
i amb el
everyone is
qual
able to
totes
live
les
their
persones
lives in
puguin
dignity
acomplir el seu projecte vital en pau, amb dignitat i igualtat. Ens exhorteu a la cooperació, a mobilitzar esforços multilaterals i a fer-ho d'acord amb els valors fundacionals de les Nacions Unides i comptant amb la inclusió de tothom. Els dies 20 i 21 de l'abril passat, Andorra va acollir la 37a Cimera Iberoamericana de caps d'estat i de govern sota el lema Innovació per al desenvolupament sostenible, objectiu 20, en què la veu del nostre país, un país de 78.000 habitants, es va dirigir a una comunitat formada per 670 milions de persones. Vam tenir l'oportunitat de reivindicar el paper essencial del multilateralisme, en especial davant de reptes com el coronavirus o el canvi climàtic, perquè cap país, cap estat, per poderós que sigui, pot fer front a un repte d'aquesta magnitud sense la participació de la resta de la comunitat internacional. Al llarg d'aquests darrers mesos hem comprovat com les vacunes són l'esperança per frenar la Covid-19. El vaccí és l'eina més potent que tenim per combatre aquesta pandèmia, però no servirà de res si no arriba al braç de tots els habitants del planeta. Per aquest motiu, com ja vaig demanar aquell 21 d'abril, cal que la col·laboració que ha existit entre institucions públiques, el sector privat, les universitats i els centres d'investigació es traslladi també en la distribució de les vacunes. No és admissible que encara existeixi una diferència tan gran respecte al percentatge de població vacunada entre països desenvolupats i països en via de desenvolupament. Ens va advertir l'Organització Mundial de la Salut que aquesta actitud ens situava a un pas d'un fracàs moral catastròfic, perquè la pandèmia seguirà el seu curs mentre la solució sigui parcial. Som a temps de vital, donant suport i impulsant els millors sistemes com ara COVAX, al qual Andorra té l'honor de contribuir, que permeten garantir a temps un accés universal a la vacuna. L'emergència climàtica és l'altre gran repte que hem d'enfocar des de la inclusió. No hi ha marxa enrere. És tard per esmenar els nostres errors amb el medi ambient, però no és tard per deixar de cometre. La pròxima dècada és fonamental per assegurar el futur del nostre planeta. Esperem que la COP26 del mes de novembre a Glasgow, com la darrera oportunitat per avançar perquè els compromisos de les economies més potents siguin reals per aconseguir la neutralitat de carboni. El nostre país dona la benvinguda a les reunions d'alt nivell que se celebren en el marc de la 76a Assemblea de les Nacions Unides, com ara la cimera dels sistemes alimentaris, que no pot ser més oportuna i en la qual Andorra hi prendrà. La producció agrícola, la seva distribució, les rendes i les pautes de consum tenen el màxim impacte en les persones i en el medi. La reconciliació amb la natura i amb el planeta és possible des d'un nou prisma integrador en què la nutrició saludable i el coneixement tradicional s'uneixin amb el científic per innovar amb l'objectiu de conservar l'únic recurs que tenim i que hem de saber compartir de forma duradora, el planeta. Andorra se suma a la crida global perquè es faci realitat de forma imminent l'ODS2, zero fam. La realitat és que la fam està augmentant, alhora que els casos d'obesitat infantil també s'incrementen, d'acord amb l'informe sobre la inseguretat alimentària de la FAO i altres agents. Aquestes tendències, a priori totalment contraposades, ens han de fer reflexionar sobre la necessitat urgent de reformar els sistemes de producció i consum d'aliments, per tal d'avançar cap a models i pautes de consum més sostenibles i més saludables. Per aquest motiu reconeixem el paper de la FAO i del Programa Mundial d'Aliments per contribuir a la consecució d'aquest ODS, que hauria de ser assolit de la manera més immediata possible. Excel·lències, ens trobem en un exercici de reconstrucció des de múltiples nivells. La salut, l'economia, el medi ambient i la immigració. Fins i tot, els nostres models de treball, de mobilitat o de consum s'han posat en dubte. I el gran interrogant que hem de resoldre és desitjable tornar a la normalitat perduda? Aprofitem aquest gran organisme que són les Nacions Unides per resoldre aquest interrogant, perquè el multilateralisme s'erigeixi en la via adequada per trobar solucions dràstiques. Les Nacions Unides proporcionen els marcs per avançar amb la capacitat per detectar i diagnosticar on hi ha desequilibris, on hi ha injustícia, qui són els més vulnerables i com els estats podem contribuir a posar-hi. Hem d'insistir en el pilar dels drets humans, que ens ha de guiar en qualsevol de les nostres accions. Així doncs, donem suport a la proposta del secretari general de convocar una cimera del futur. La preservació de la pau i la seguretat forma part de la raison d'être d'aquesta organització. És un dels seus pilars fundacionals. Però veiem amb molta preocupació l'agreujament de les crisis humanitàries, sobretot per l'augment de la pobresa, els desastres naturals cada vegada més freqüents i devastadors o la disminució de l'ajut internacional. Hi ha casos colpidors que fa molts anys que duren. Les Nacions Unides disposen de mecanismes com les operacions de manteniment de la pau que han d'alleugerir aquestes situacions, però la prevenció, que és multidimensional, ha de situar-se com l'objectiu principal de la nostra acció, amb la protecció dels més vulnerables, la inclusió i la igualtat. Hem entrat en el 76è període de sessions. Amb la declaració del 75è aniversari, els estats vam deixar clar que seguim creient en les Nacions Unides i en el multilateralisme. Sabem que hem d'actuar de manera conjunta i proactiva, que tenim nous reptes com la cooperació digital per no deixar ningú enrere o la incorporació dels joves com a vectors del canvi. Senyores i senyors, no ens enganyem. El futur de les generacions més ben preparades està a les nostres mans. La seva experiència vital, la seva maduresa depèn en bona part de les conseqüències de les nostres accions o inaccions. No els podem decebre una vegada més. L'educació és un dels drets humans que des de l'adopció de l'Agenda 2030, amb l'ODS 4, s'ha reconegut com un dels principals catalitzadors per al desenvolupament sostenible, per a l'erradicació de la pobresa i la prevenció de conflictes. L'empoderament de les persones i de les comunitats amb l'educació de qualitat és la millor forma d'aconseguir la transformació de les societats i la protecció dels drets. Quan l'educació reverteix en les nenes i en les dones, quan es compta amb elles per a tots els aspectes de la seva vida, quan es treballa en la seva inclusió, es donen les condicions per al progrés econòmic i social que beneficia a tothom. La igualtat, l'equilibri de gènere exigeixen la participació activa de les dones. No solament han de formar part dels llocs on es prenen les decisions, sinó que les veus de les dones han de ser considerades i preses en compte sempre amb atenció i sigui quina sigui la seva situació i cònjuge. S'ha de trobar, en definitiva, una nova relació per acabar amb esquemes patriarcals com a llast per a la meitat de la població. L'empoderament que s'havia accelerat no pot aturar-se, no pot anar enrere amb el temps. En aquest sentit, vull agrair la tasca que porta a terme UN Women i voldria felicitar des d'aquí la nova directora executiva, l'ambaixadora Sima Bauhaus. Andorra manté el seu compromís en aquest àmbit perquè el nostre país ha apostat fermament en els darrers anys per impulsar polítiques d'igualtat. Una voluntat que s'ha plasmat en la nostra legislació, que ha anat configurant un sistema de foment d'aquesta igualtat i de lluita contra la discriminació pioner i ambiciós. Senyor president, Andorra forma part d'aquesta comunitat internacional des del 1990. El nostre és un país de dimensions territorials i demogràfiques reduïdes, però la nostra dimensió no ha de ser ni ha estat mai un subterfugi per no respondre i fer front de forma decidida i plenament implicada a les responsabilitats i als reptes nacionals i internacionals. L'any 2013, amb motiu del 20è aniversari de l'ingrés d'Andorra a les Nacions Unides, el màxim representant visitava el nostre país. El secretari general de l'ONU, Ban Ki-moon, va destacar per damunt de tot, i cito textualment, la dignitat del poble andorrà, l'orgull que sentiu per la vostra història, per la vostra singularitat i per la vostra solidaritat. I ens va demanar de fer encara més. Així ho vam entendre i ens hi vam comprometre. Som part d'aquesta comunitat i tots n'hem d'assumir la mateixa responsabilitat. És en aquest sentit que enfrontem la crisi climàtica en el nostre medi ambient. Al mes d'agost passat, tots els mitjans de comunicació es feien ressò de les conclusions del darrer informe del panel intergovernamental per al canvi climàtic de les Nacions Unides, el qual ens alertava de les greus conseqüències del canvi climàtic i de l'escalfament global. Com deia, el compte enrere ha començat. En relació amb la mitigació i l'adaptació al canvi climàtic, hem adoptat els compromisos de l'Acord de París i hem apostat per la producció d'energies renovables, la fiscalitat al carboni per reduir les emissions i una neutralitat per al 2050. Estem portant a terme un treball molt important a favor de la biodiversitat mitjançant una estratègia nacional i volem esdevenir el primer país que sigui reserva de la biosfera, fruit del nostre model d'equilibri entre desenvolupament i sostenibilitat. Estem fent grans esforços per encaminar la transició energètica, per impulsar energies renovables, promovent línies de subvenció amb programes destinats a l'eficiència energètica dels edificis i per la mobilitat elèctrica. La imminent entrada en vigor de la taxa sobre el CO2 ens ha permès també rebaixar significativament els preus del transport públic. També aprovarem en breu una llei sobre l'economia circular que ens permeti passar d'una economia lineal a un model econòmic més eficient que optimitzi l'ús dels recursos naturals, minimitzi els impactes ambientals, fomenti que els productes i recursos mantinguin la utilitat i valor tant temps com sigui possible i eviti emissions i pèrdues de temps. Excel·lències, l'acció d'Andorra per pal·liar l'impacte de la Covid-19 ha tingut com a objectiu principal garantir la salut de les persones i preservar el sistema sanitari. Agraeixo la solidaritat dels nostres veïns, França, Espanya i Portugal, en la distribució de les vacunes, així com els mecanismes d'aprovisionament de la Unió Europea i de l'OMS a través del programa COVAX, mitjançant el qual Andorra ja ha pogut vacunar amb la pauta completa a gairebé el 75% de la seva població major. L'impacte de la Covid-19 sobre l'economia andorrana ha estat dur. Andorra és un país que té una extrema dependència del sector turístic, però el govern ha estat al costat de les famílies, dels treballadors i de les empreses. Ara, la irrupció d'aquesta pandèmia ens ha fet accelerar alguns dels processos que havíem endegat i impulsar-ne de nous per repensar el turisme com un vector econòmic sostenible i obrir la nostra economia cap a nous sectors. Apostem per una recuperació que ha de ser una oportunitat per crear estabilitat, creixement i diversificació econòmica, generant nous llocs de treball i reorientant la despesa pública cap a aquells sectors que generin un efecte de diversificació més gran, amb una atenció especial a les polítiques que reforcin la salut, la sostenibilitat, el coneixement, la innovació i el capital humà. La pandèmia de la Covid-19 ens ha posat a prova com a societat. Hem après que el present i el futur ens exigeixen menys individualisme, menys egoisme, menys confrontació i, en canvi, més cooperació, més resiliència, més empatia i més solidaritat. Cap
No
país,
country, no
cap
community
comunitat
has
no
been
ha
able
pogut
to
abordar
address
aquesta
this
crisi
pandemic
sense
without
una
a concept
solidària.
of solidarity.
Per la nostra vocació,
Due to our
pel nostre
vocation
tarannà,
and given our
Andorra
nature,
no es pot
cannot
permetre deixar ningú
allow
enrere
itself
i
to leave
actuarem
anyone
amb totes les
behind. We
nostres
will do
energies
everything we
per
can to
contribuir
contribute
amb
with all
tots
of you to
vostès
changing this
perquè el
world
món
in
es
accordance with
transformi
the
d'acord
Agenda
amb els
2030
compromisos
goals.
de l'Agenda 2030. Des
It is
d'aquestes
with this
premisses
message
i
and by
reafirmant
reiterating
el nostre
our commitment,
compromís clar
clear
amb el
commitment
multilateralisme
to
i amb les Nacions
multilateralism and
Unides,
the United
encarem
Nations
des del
that we
Principat
enter
d'Andorra
this
aquest
76th
76è
session
període
of
de
the
decisió.
General Assembly of the United
Moltes
Nations.
gràcies.
I thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le chef de gouvernement du Principauté d'Andorre pour l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eswatini to introduce an address by the head of government.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I have the honor to introduce a pre-recorded statement by His Excellency the Right Honorable Cleopas Sipho-Dlamini, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Eswatini, during the general debate of the 76th session of the General Assembly. I thank you.
The President, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Cabinet, United Nations Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, it is my singular honor to address the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Allow me to express my sincere congratulations to you, Mr. President, on your election as President of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. We commend the outstanding leadership and sterling performance of the outgoing President. I also extend our profound congratulations to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his re-election for another 5-year term. The theme of this session touches on every aspect of our daily lives. It underscores the need to ensure that the world does not lose sight of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development during the last decade of implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the decade of action. Over the past year, the Kingdom of Eswatini experienced immeasurable and unimaginable setbacks in implementation of our development priorities since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. This compelled the country to rethink its development strategy and redirect its resources to cater for additional needs of the population. Nevertheless, we have not lost sight of the objective of 2030 Agenda, to leave no one behind. Mr. President, sincere appreciation goes to all the frontline medical workers who have become the first line of defense in the battle against the virulent pandemic, laboring tirelessly to keep us safe. Many of them throughout this challenging period lost their lives for our sake. Without their commitment and sacrifice, the world would not have been anywhere near the path to recovery from this pandemic. In the same vein, similar appreciation and honor also goes to all those involved in research, sharing of expertise and resource mobilization, be it institutions and individuals, for the successful development of vaccines. It is without doubt that the panacea for all practical, effective, and efficient plan to recover from COVID-19 pandemic rests on vaccination of the nation population. This has been demonstrated and proven in countries that have endeavored to achieve herd immunity. Low access to vaccines by many countries remains a cause for concern. Such a scenario has been more pronounced in developing countries, especially countries in special situations in Africa and other vulnerable regions. This was one of the pressing reasons why Eswatini supported the call for a temporal waiver of the obligation of member states under the TRIPS agreement to protect intellectual property rights for technologies related to the prevention, containment of treatment of COVID-19. The Kingdom of Eswatini applauds the establishment of the COVAX facility, which came to existence through efforts by the United Nations in the wake of the pandemic and solely meant to be of assistance to member states, particularly low middle-income countries. As a beneficiary, Eswatini is grateful for such an initiative and also extends further appreciation to the generous donors, particularly the United States of America, amongst many others, whom their absence, the objective of this initiative would not have been achieved thus far. Mr. President, in this view, the Kingdom of Eswatini commends African countries that have commenced manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines. We bank on the successful implementation of the African Continent Free Trade Area to widen and strengthen Africa's integration process. We are confident that this arrangement will create or strengthen the value chains and the ability of African countries to produce more vaccines. Eswatini has prioritized health for every member of the population, is at the center of our socio-economic agenda. Currently, a significant percentage of our eligible population has been vaccinated, having commenced with our frontline staff and elderly. Most recently, effective 30th August 2021, the Eswatini government commenced inoculation all aged 18 years and above. We aim at reaching herd immunity, hopefully by the end of 2021. Mr. President, the resilience is a multifaceted and complex concept that calls for our attention to comprehend its meaning academically and in practice. It entails the ability to bounce back, and build better from any situation that confronts us. In the context of the pandemic, resilience transcends the health sector to cut across all sectors of the economy. The Kingdom of Eswatini believes that the starting point of building resilience through hope entails access to vaccination by all eligible population, and while doing so, ensuring that no one is left behind. This will determine the ability, power, and speed to recover from COVID-19 and to rebuild sustainably. Like many other countries, the pandemic has been an eye-opener for the Kingdom of Eswatini and has overly sensitized government to rethink resilience and incorporate in its policies. In this view, building resilience has become a cornerstone and an inevitable component in all our mitigation, adaptation strategies, and recovery plans. Mr. President, the pandemic has momentarily shifted our focus from issues that are perpetually on the global agenda, particularly our quest to respond to the needs of the planet, including mitigation and adaptation to persisting impact of climate change. Nonetheless, it has highlighted our interconnectedness in all facets of our daily lives and further clarified the meaning and practicality of living in a global village. Climate-related impacts continue to overwhelm our economy and remains one of the insistent challenges of the 21st century. The Kingdom of Eswatini has not lost sight of its commitment to respond to the needs of the planet. In this view, we reaffirm our resolve to play our part in operationalizing the intended nationally determined contribution that presents steps taken by the country to develop effective climate change responses, whilst fast-tracking the implementation of our objectives for sustainable development and poverty eradication. We look forward to the 26th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, for the world to reignite, re-engage, and accelerate climate actions. Mr. President, education is an important tool utilized to equip, recapacitate, develop, and empower every learner to create and/or sustain development and attain the future we want. The closure of schools and institutions of higher learning due to the pandemic has had an unparalleled devastating impact to millions of learners. This has been more pronounced in developing world, mainly because many of the countries are not adequately equipped to pursue their education virtually. The impact of students being out of school for an extended period of time was enormously and a nightmare in many developing countries. The lack of access to digital learning resources was a setback for students' learning opportunities. Upon resumption of classes in the Kingdom of Eswatini, schools had to stagger attendance in order to prevent the snowballing of infections and the spread of the virus as it evolves and changes phases. Mr. President, it is important to highlight the fact that our economies have been severely battered. Businesses continue to close down and people are losing jobs. Governments are struggling with rising debt levels. Eswatini is therefore appreciative of the decision by the Board of Governors of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to approve special drawing rights to boost global liquidity. This cash injection of over 75 million to the economy of Eswatini could not have come at a better time. On Monday, 6 September 2021, His Majesty King Mswati III launched the Reconstruction Fund meant to rebuild infrastructure and the economy following a civil unrest which was brought about by a vast array of economic challenges, including the added burden of COVID-19 pandemic. And these funds will assist government advance closer to the target of $200 million. Mr. President, another note in the fight against HIV and AIDS, Eswatini has continued to employ all means possible to stop the spread of the virus, even during this critical time in history. This is evidenced by the achievement of the UNAIDS goal of 95-95-95, which summarily means 95% of people with HIV identified, 95% of the people with HIV treatment, and 95% of the people on treatment virally suppressed. Although this was deemed achievable, in a decade from now, fortunately, the Kingdom is now one of the 2 countries to have made such an achievement of SDG goal number 3 on health, as announced by the United Nations body. In Eswatini, as much as some of our plans to accelerate the process have been derailed, we have remained focused. Since 2016, the country has integrated the SDGs into the National Development Framework and put in place appropriate institutional arrangements to ensure that the implementation is properly monitored at all levels. Government has infused the spirit of ownership to every citizen so that every individual understands and appreciates the importance of the SDGs. Both the executive and the legislative arms of government are involved. In the midst of obtaining challenges, we have not lost hope and sight of our development agenda. Mr. President, as the reforms of the United Nations development system evolves, the Kingdom of Eswatini continues to steadfastly reiterate and maintains its call for Africa's voice to be heard at the United Nations Security Council. This follows an annual call by the African Union heads of state and government articulated in the Ezulwini Consensus and CETA Declaration. The common African position remains intact with regard to allocation of permanent and non-permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council, a very important decision-making organ of the United Nations. When all members and regions are efficiently and effectively represented and their voice conspicuously heard, the revitalization of the work of the United Nations will be enhanced. Mr. President, may I take this opportunity to share with the nations of the world how the Tinkunda system of government works. The elections conducted under this system embrace our traditional and cultural existence, where people from communities nominate candidates in their chiefdoms to compete at constituency levels, which we call Tinkundla. This system was agreed upon by the nation through consultations. A commission was set up to consult widely the populace as to which governance system they would like to have in place as a nation. The winners then go straight to Parliament as a direct representation. Some of the elected candidates end up being members of cabinet. As a result, the people are part of the government formulation process because they can claim ownership of the people who constitute the government of the day. We are convinced that our system of governance has a place in modern-day democracy, and it complies with all structures of the United Nations family. The Kingdom of Eswatini is committed to the ideals of the United Nations in just as much as it is dedicated to protecting its history, legacy, and destiny. We, at the same time, embracing the opportunities and the possibilities of cooperating in the community of nations. It is therefore the Kingdom of Eswatini's position that it believes in democracy as an idea, but not as an ideal, because things that are ideal to you may not be ideal to other people. The Kingdom of Eswatini will, however, continue to embrace the opportunities, technologies, and the mechanisms that create modern society. Our country is committed to a process of consultation with the people at the People's Parliament, Sibaya, and other dialogue forums through which people provide advice and counsel to the King that ensures that transparency and accountability. This is how our democracy operates in council. As such, the practice is democratic and participatory in that everybody is involved in our key decision-making processes. As a nation, we shall remain seized with the preservation of our cultural norms and traditions, promoting of peace and stability, addressing our different opinions in a peaceful manner, not by violence. Above all this, dialogue is at the apex of our existence as a nation. Our philosophy is inclusive. We use a bottom-up approach from grassroots level where every Liswati must have an opportunity to voice his or her opinion in a free and fair environment. Whilst we embrace modernity, we cannot forget who we are and where we come from. Our identity as a nation remains pivotal so that we can work together to develop our country and ensure that we realize a robust social and economic foundation for the benefit of future generations, as our predecessors have done. Mr. President, the persistent exclusion of the Republic of China, Taiwan, from the United Nations and the discrimination of its citizens in a system meant to serve international citizens is a gross violation of the unshakable principles of the UN Charter. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan is, in solidarity with the UN member states, made a significant contribution in realizing the theme of this year's session. Eswatini would again this year continue to urge the United Nations to consider the meaningful participation of Taiwan, especially in the World Health Organization, International Civil Aviation Authority, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. With this inclusion of Taiwan, it is our hope that the UN will be living up to its objectives and equally serving the interests of all its member states. The path of 2030 on the attainment of the UN SDGs was dented as a result of the pandemic, and Taiwan, adhering to the principle of leaving no one behind, shared its disease prevention expertise and experience with more than 80 countries, and further assisted 40 countries make headways in ICT, agriculture, education, and health. Furthermore, this year, in demonstrating that Taiwan can help and Taiwan is helping, Taiwan continued to send medical assistance in the form of medical specialists and protective equipment for Eswatini's health sector. It is in this light that we call upon for the recognition of Taiwan's efforts for the global well-being. Lastly, the Kingdom of Eswatini can attest to the fact that Taiwan is an indispensable partner and would, if given an opportunity, play a meaningful role in the global body. Mr. President, finally, allow me to take this opportunity to wish the United Nations family a prosperous future as we battle COVID-19 to rebuild sustainably and respond to the needs of the people. Thank you, and may the Almighty God bless us all.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Eswatini for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to introduce an address by the head of government.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves.
Excellencies, we are convened at this 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly at a time of severe health, socioeconomic, political, climatic, and security challenges globally, though unevenly, not in equal measure. The raging pandemic of COVID-19, which came upon us early last year, has put the world in a veritable tailspin, even as the rollout of the vaccines has eased the strain somewhat, particularly in the developed world. A major shift has occurred in the global condition. A parallelogram of unruly and complex forces has been unleashed. A new paradigm has emerged. Outmoded approaches are becoming or have become irrelevant. Fresh initiatives and directions are required, and transformational leadership is needed now more than ever. In my country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a small island developing state with all its historical legacies of underdevelopment and contemporary burdens and limitations, has had to cope additionally with the devastating volcanic eruptions of April 2021, the onrushing Atlantic hurricane season, vaccine hesitance among the population, and real uncertainty about the future. Amidst all this, our people are nevertheless possessed of a settled resilience and optimism of life and living, undergirded by God's redemptive grace, our own possibilities and strengths, a sterling regional solidarity, and promising internationalist support, inclusive of that of our United Nations, for peace and security, good health and prosperity for our people, as pledged in the Sustainable Development Goals. Immediately, all of us in this global family of nations must work together to defeat COVID-19, return to an acceptable level of normalcy, and the opening up of our economies. This represents a many-sided and enormous challenge of historic proportions in both diagnosis and prescription. A huge bundle of pre-existing divisive and debilitating conditions ought to be efficaciously addressed. Historic wrongs ought to be righted, and extant and emergent limitations and weaknesses, real or contrived, require appropriate correctives. The metaphoric lions and lionesses globally ought to converse with each other meaningfully, rather than hanker for perpetual disorder, insecurity, and war. They do not actually need to lay down with each other in joyous embrace. They ought simply to resolve their differences, whether ancient or modern, and compromise where necessary and desirable in the interest of all. But for the sake of humanity, let us drop the vaunted self-interests, the vanities, and divisiveness, real or imagined, and work together for the better. These are the ennobling impulses which prompted the ancient prophets and teachers of all the world's monotheistic religions to summon their peoples and their better angels to uplifting purposes in this our earthly city. These have been the civilizing sentiments expressed from time immemorial in the voices of wise emperors and thoughtful warriors. These are humanity's core values, which constitute the bedrock upon which our United Nations organization was originally built and has been henceforth sustained. Faith in them and accompanying works will see us through these troubling times in which it appears that things are falling apart and the center cannot hold. The COVID-19 pandemic has put the global community at the critical proverbial crossroads. What is to be done? First, let us recognize and internalize the novel historic juncture at which we are, and accept generally the sage poetic advice that two roads diverge in the woods, and we ought to take the one least traveled by, and that will make all the difference. This will not be easy for historic combatants or contemporary rivals to do, but it is the only choice that humanity has. In tackling the pandemic itself, the old ways have tended to predominate, even as the sunlit rays of a possible new path have emerged. Thus, for example, globally, we have witnessed unacceptable vaccine nationalism, the politicization of the rollout of the vaccines, and the rollout of the vaccines for the rich first and the poor afterwards. To be sure, we have also witnessed notable and noble work by some global institutions, such as the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the COVAX facility, to make vaccines more accessible to poor or marginalized countries. It is true, too, though relatively late in the day, that some rich countries in the North Atlantic, the United States of America, Canada, and the United Kingdom, have delivered or agreed to deliver freely from their surpluses vaccines to some less developed countries. We are very grateful. Still, though, some of these countries may be so slow in their promised deliveries that they may end up embarrassingly with expired doses of the vaccines running into several millions. It is timely to remind all of us that the noblest form of solidarity is to give not from the abundance or surplus that we may have, but from the little that we possess. That is the lesson of the proverbial widow's mite. In this regard, on behalf of the Caribbean, I thank the government of the Republic of India for their early and meaningful gift of Covishield AstraZeneca vaccines. Sadly, at least one country in the North Atlantic has refused to recognize Covishield for entry of persons into that country. Mr. President, not only have the ways of the old order pre-COVID tended still to guide powerful countries in their actions, so too the global behemoths in global communications. These entities, enveloped in mega profits and profiteering, own and control the various internet platforms with little or no public regulation, and have ignored or abandoned any real sense of responsibility for the anti-vax misinformation and disinformation which occupy cyberspace. As a consequence, real people die in their multitudes across the world. Surely, this irresponsibility must stop. Surely, too, many ancient and long-standing political quarrels ought to come to an end in these new perilous times which humanity faces. At the top of the list must undoubtedly include the refusal of Israel and its international backers to come to terms with the requisite of an independent Palestine and a secure Israel in accord with repeated resolutions of this august body. And similarly, the refusal of the United States of America to dismantle the internationally unlawful and crippling economic blockade of Cuba and to bring to an end the unjust, harsh, unilateral economic and financial sanctions against Venezuela and, to a lesser extent, Nicaragua. So too, it is high time for this United Nations and its agencies to cease the exclusion of Taiwan from meaningful participation. Surely the world will benefit from Taiwan's inclusion in global bodies such as the World Health Assembly, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and Interpol. Concerted multilateral cooperation on global matters such as health, climate change, civil aviation, crime, and so forth requires all hands on deck, metaphorically speaking. Taiwan is a relatively small but illegitimate political expression of the magnificent Chinese civilization. It has been an impressive economic miracle. It is a thriving democracy, and it has a right to ask for meaningful inclusion in the relevant global institutions. New times demand fresh solutions, not old-fashioned hegemonic responses. By now, Mr. President, the folly of invading and seeking to remake countries in an invader's image and likeness is plain for all to see in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The human and economic costs are staggering. Still, though, the values of our United Nations demand that women must be respected and empowered, that religious discrimination must be rejected, that theocracies accommodate competing voices, and that terrorism and political violence be not embedded in any statecraft. The sacred principles of non-intervention and non-interference ought not to be blind, perpetually or at all, to unacceptable and egregious excesses against humanity. Mr. President, a looming ecological disaster awaits humanity unless we change course for the better. No serious person who objectively examines the scientific data can but conclude that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and especially to small island developing states and countries such as in West Africa and the Sahel region, which are being swept into seemingly unending natural disasters as a consequence of desertification and extreme land degradation. Science, the real world, and the Paris Accord have pointed to alternative pathways for humanity. But the political will and requisite resources from the major emitters to address the grave challenge of climate change have not gone much beyond pious mouthings and marginal tinkering. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is hoping for the best at the Conference of Parties in Glasgow in November 2021. But we fear the worst. More procrastination and the ducking of serious responsibility by the major emitters. On this, humanity is at the midnight hour. Can we meet the challenge? We may not live to find out the answer if the usual continues. Mr. President, there is a range of other pressing concerns relevant to the Caribbean that demand urgent global multilateral action. These include meaningful debt restructuring and a favorable reform of the global financial architecture, the replacing of certain wrong-headed criteria, such as GDP per head of population, by a vulnerability index to determine access to development financing, the cessation of the use of unilateral sanctions, and the weaponizing of the financial and banking systems against small states, including the capricious termination of corresponding banking relationships, the reversal of the diminution or slowdown of official development assistance by rich countries, that small island exceptionalism be accepted as a category to be objectively embraced in efficacious actions on the Sustainable Development Goals and a rules-based international order, the necessity and desirability for reparatory justice from European nations in respect of native genocide and the enslavement of Africans, from which the European nations profited systematically and from which consequentially our Caribbean countries have suffered a legacy of underdevelopment, and the urgent need for an appropriate multilateral initiative to assist Haiti, a CARICOM member, in its current peril. Mr. President, at our United Nations, the reform agenda, including that of the Security Council reform, demand renewed impetus. We have been talking about this subject for far too long and avoiding concrete steps forward. St. Vincent and the Grenadines recognizes the difficulties at hand, but it is evident to all reasonable persons that the stranglehold of the Permanent Five on the Security Council ought to be appropriately loosened or broken in these times, which are so different than in 1945. St. Vincent and Grenadines has been honored over the past 2 years to sit as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the smallest country ever to sit on this esteemed council. All objective observers concur that we have carried out our work and responsibilities commendably and have contributed to the maintenance and advancement of peace, security, and prosperity globally. Importantly, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been a central party to the establishment of an institutional nexus known as the A3+1, the 3 non-permanent members from Africa, plus St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the African diaspora. And they has a distinctive voice for Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Long may this nexus continue, especially in this, the UN decade for peoples of African descent. Mr. President, the lessons of today mirror many of those lodged in the tiring and oft-times tired struggles of yesteryear, from whence, in the still smoldering ashes of global conflict, our forebears crafted this multilateral institution called the United Nations to provide hope and stability to all of humanity. Yet this labor is incomplete. The pervasive inequalities that defined the pre-COVID political and socioeconomic order must not now become tomorrow's nightmarish reality. Instead, in this COVID era, we must reorganize ourselves locally, regionally, nationally, and globally in a quest to provide peace, security, and development to all countries and peoples in novel ways and with fresh initiatives. And let us also, with a renewed sense of urgency and compassion, serve to protect and improve upon this planet that we all call home. It is pellucid that of all time, only the future is ours to desecrate. Our United Nations ought never to be accomplices in any such desecration. So I reiterate, we are at historic crossroads of a special kind. We must rise collectively to address sensibly the requisite fresh imperatives in these, our most challenging times. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister, Minister for Finance, the Public Service, National Security, Legal Affairs and Grenadines Affairs for the statement just made. Maintenant, je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Haïti pour introduire le discours du chef de gouvernement.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
Your Excellences, Mesdames, Messieurs les chefs de délégation,
ladies and gentlemen, heads
Monsieur le Secrétaire général, distingués délégués,
distinguished delegates,
Mesdames, Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen,
pour la deuxième année consécutive, la session ordinaire de l'Assemblée générale de notre organisation se tient en pleine situation pandémique. En effet, depuis bientôt 2 ans, le monde croule sous le poids des conséquences désastreuses de la pandémie de Covid-19. Les morts se comptent par millions, les personnes affectées par centaines de millions. Nos systèmes sanitaires sont mis à rude épreuve et l'économie mondiale est exsangue. Face à cette situation, pour limiter les dégâts, les mesures de précaution et de restrictions sanitaires sont inévitables. Pour cette raison notamment, le Premier ministre, son Excellence Dr Ariel Henry, n'a pas pu faire le déplacement pour participer physiquement au débat général. Je vous invite donc à écouter son discours de circonstance préenregistré. Je vous remercie de votre attention et vous souhaite une bonne écoute. Merci.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale,
Mr. President of the General Assembly,
Monsieur le Secrétaire général,
Secretary General, Sir, Excellencies,
Mesdames, Messieurs
ladies
les
and gentlemen, ambassadors, distinguished delegates.
Permettez-moi, Monsieur
I
le
would like,
Président,
Mr. President,
de vous adresser
to
d'entrée de jeu
convey from
mes
the
plus vives
outset to you my sincere
pour votre
congratulations
élection
on your
à la
election
tête
to
de la
the head of the
76e session
76th
ordinaire
regular
de
session
l'Assemblée
of
générale
the
de
United
notre
Nations General
organisation.
Assembly. I would also convey my congratulations to the members of the Bureau. I can assure you of the full support of the Haitian delegation to ensure our work is truly successful. I would also like to commend the remarkable work carried out during the 75th session of the organization by your predecessor, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey.
Il a su conduire les travaux avec dextérité et
work with
leadership,
great skill and leadership,
malgré les contraintes
despite the
imposées
constraints
par la
brought
pandémie
by the
Covid-19.
COVID-19 pandemic.
Il me plaît de renouveler mes
I would
félicitations au
like to
secrétaire général des
congratulate
Nations
once
Unies
again the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres,
pour sa
on his
réélection à la tête
re-election
de
to the head
l'organisation.
of the organization.
Ce n'est pas par
It
hasard
is
que
no
les États membres
coincidence
vous ont
that
accordé
member
un second
states
mandat
have granted you
qui,
a second
j'en
term,
suis
sir,
convaincu, sera couronné
which
de
I am
succès.
sure will be crowned with success.
Je veux saisir cette opportunité
I would like to take this
pour vous
opportunity
exprimer ma
to
reconnaissance
express my
pour votre
gratitude
soutien
to you
constant au peuple
for your
haïtien
ongoing support
et
to the
surtout
Haitian people
pour
and,
l'engagement
most
renouvelé et
importantly,
solidaire
for the renewed
de
commitment and
l'organisation envers mon
involvement
pays.
of the organization to my country.
Je m'en voudrais
It would
de
be
ne pas
remiss of
réaffirmer
me not to
toute
reaffirm
l'appréciation
the
du gouvernement de
deep
la République
appreciation
d'Haïti
of the government of the
pour
Republic of Haiti
l'initiative
for
du
the
bureau de la
Bureau's
75e
initiative of the
session de
75th
l'Assemblée
session of the
générale
General Assembly
d'organiser une cérémonie
to
d'hommage
organize a
le
tribute
14 juillet
on the 14th of
2021
July
à la
2021
mémoire de son
to
Excellence
His
le
Excellency,
président Jovenel Moïse.
in the memory of His Excellency President
Il est
Jovenel
décédé
Moïse.
tragiquement
He
sous des
died
balles
tragically
assassines
from
de
an
la nuit
assassin's
du 6
bullets
au 7
in the
juillet
night
dernier.
from the 6th to the 7th of
Les
July this
messages de
year.
réconfort
The
et les
messages
témoignages
of
de
support
sympathie
and
des
sympathy
gouvernements
of
des États
governments of
membres
member states
de
of the
l'organisation ont été
organization
appréciés à leur
been
juste
greatly
valeur par le
appreciated
peuple
by the
haïtien.
Haitian people.
Je veux réaffirmer ici,
I would like
à
to
cette
reaffirm
tribune,
here from this
ma
rostrum
détermination
my
à tout mettre en
determination
œuvre
to do
pour
all
trouver
I
les
can
co-auteurs,
to find
les
all of the
complices
perpetrators,
et
the
les
accomplices,
commanditaires de
and
ce
those
crime
people who
odieux.
ordered this heinous crime.
Rien,
Nothing.
absolument rien.
Absolutely nothing.
Aucune manœuvre
No
politique,
political maneuver,
aucune
no
campagne
media
médiatique,
campaign,
aucune
no
distraction
distraction
ne pourra me
can
détourner de cet
deter me
objectif,
from this goal
rendre justice
to
au
bring
président
justice
Moïse.
for
C'est une
President
dette
Moïse.
envers sa mémoire,
It is a
envers sa
duty to his
famille
memory, a
et
duty
envers
to
le
his
peuple
family,
haïtien.
and a duty to the Haitian
L'enquête
people.
judiciaire en
The
cours
criminal
est
investigation
difficile.
underway is a
Il
difficult
s'agit
one.
d'un crime
It was a
transnational.
transnational
Et
crime,
pour cela,
and
nous
because of this,
sollicitons
we are
formellement
formally
une
requesting
entraide judiciaire.
mutual legal
C'est une
assistance.
priorité
This is
gouvernementale
a
pour la
priority
nation
of
tout
my
entière,
government for the entire nation.
car ce crime ne doit
This
pas
crime
rester
must not
impuni
remain
et les coupables,
unpunished,
tous
and the
les
perpetrators,
coupables,
all the
doivent être
perpetrators,
punis.
must be brought to justice.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
le thème que
the
vous avez
theme
proposé pour
that
la
you've
76e
proposed for the
session,
76th
à
session,
savoir
namely
miser sur l'espoir pour
building
renforcer
resilience
la
through
résilience
hope
afin
to
de se
recover
relever de la
from
COVID-19,
COVID-19,
reconstruire
rebuild
durablement,
sustainably,
répondre aux besoins de la
respond to the
planète,
needs of the planet,
respecter
respect
les
the
droits
rights
des
of
personnes
people,
et
and
revitaliser
revitalize the
l'Organisation des
UN.
Nations Unies
This
arrive
theme
à
is
point
extremely timely.
En effet, la
Indeed,
pandémie du
the coronavirus
coronavirus
pandemic
a mis à
has
rude
sorely
épreuve, à des degrés
tested to
divers,
various degrees
pratiquement tous les pays de la
almost
planète.
all the countries of the world.
Cette crise sanitaire
This
mondiale
global
a
public
mis en
health
évidence, entre
crisis
autres,
has highlighted
les
inter alia the
inégalités qui
inequalities
existent
which
entre
exist
nos
between
pays
our countries.
et révélé les
It
faiblesses de nos
has
systèmes
highlighted
de
the
santé.
weaknesses of our healthcare
Cette
systems.
pandémie a aussi
This
démontré
pandemic has also
que
shown
seule la
that
solidarité et
only
la coopération
solidarity
des
and
peuples
cooperation
peuvent nous
between
permettre de
people
mettre un
can
terme.
enable us to bring it to
Heureusement
an end.
que les uns
Fortunately,
et les autres l'ont compris
countries far
et
and
se sont
wide have
engagés à
understood
partager
this
les
and have
vaccins
undertaken
avec
to
les
share
pays
vaccines
moins
with
pauvres.
the worst of countries.
Le programme
The
COVAX
COVAX
de
program
l'Organisation
of the
mondiale de la
World
santé
Health Organization,
ainsi que les
as well
actions
as
bilatérales
bilateral
de
action
solidarité
and
à l'échelle de
assistance
la
at
planète
the global
donnent
level
l'espoir
gives
que tous
us the
ensemble,
hope
nous
that
pourrons
all
arriver à
together
vaincre
we
cette
can
maladie.
manage to beat this disease.
L'enjeu est de taille
Much is at
pour
stake
l'avenir de
for the
l'humanité.
future of humanity. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
le maintien de la paix et de la
the
sécurité
maintenance of international
internationale
peace and security
demeure l'un
has
des
remained
objectifs prioritaires
one of the
de
top priorities
l'Organisation
of the
des
United
Nations
Nations
Unies depuis sa
Organization
création.
and has done so since it was
Sur
set
cette
up.
base,
Based on
les
this,
activités de l'organisation couvrent
the
principalement
organization's
les
activities
domaines de
mainly
la
cover the
prévention
areas
des
of conflict
conflits,
prevention,
du
the
rétablissement, du
rebuilding
maintien et
and
de la
maintenance, and
conciliation
also
de la paix.
consolidation of peace.
Nous reconnaissons que l'ONU
We
a beaucoup
recognize
fait
that
pour
the
préserver notre
UN has done a
monde
great deal
du
to
fléau d'une guerre
preserve our
mondiale.
world from the
Mais
scourge of a world war.
est
However,
cependant
we must
d'admettre
nonetheless admit
que de nombreuses
that
zones de
numerous
tension et de
areas of
conflit
tension and violent
violents
conflict
continuent de
continue
représenter
to
le plus grand
represent
défi
the
auquel fait
greatest
face notre
challenge
organisation.
facing our
Il
organization.
nous faut trouver des réponses
We need to
pertinentes
find
et
the
adéquates
right,
aux nouvelles
appropriate
menaces auxquelles
responses
notre monde est
to the
confronté,
new threats
telles
that
que la
are
montée
facing
en
our world.
puissance
These
du
include the
terrorisme
rise of
international,
international
les atrocités
terrorism,
de masse,
mass
la criminalité
atrocities,
transfrontalière ou
cross-border
d'autres
crime,
défis
and
comme
other challenges
l'extrême
such as extreme
pauvreté et
poverty
le
and
changement
climate
climatique.
change.
Le phénomène des changements climatiques
Climate
représente
change
une
is
préoccupation
a
majeure
major
pour
concern
tous les États de la
for
planète.
all countries in the world.
Le réchauffement
Global
climatique,
warming,
les conditions météorologiques
severe
sévères
weather
avec
conditions,
une alternance de sécheresse et
alternating between
d'inondations
drought and
qui affectent
floods,
la production
which
agricole
affect
et alimentaire,
agricultural and food production,
l'élévation du niveau
and
des
rising
mers
sea levels.
produisent
These
des
are all
conséquences
having a
dramatiques à
significant
l'échelle mondiale.
impact globally.
Il nous faut impérativement
There is an urgent
prendre les
need
mesures
for us to take
appropriées
appropriate
en vue de
measures
freiner le rythme de
to
l'augmentation de la
slow the rise in
température à la
temperature
surface
of
du
the
globe.
planet's surface.
D'où la
Thus,
nécessité
there
d'agir
is a need to
immédiatement
act
et de façon
immediately and
collective.
collectively.
J'encourage
I would
tous les États
encourage all
parties
states
à mettre en œuvre les mesures
to implement
ambitieuses
far-reaching
adoptées à
measures
Paris
adopted
afin d'éviter
in
une
Paris
catastrophe
in order to
climatique
avoid
qui risque de
in
mettre
order
en
to
péril
avoid a climate
l'existence
disaster
même de
that
l'humanité.
risks imperiling the very
Monsieur le
existence of
Président,
humanity. Mr.
dans le
President,
registre
in the
humanitaire,
humanitarian
le
sphere,
Haut Commissariat des
the
Nations Unies
United
pour les
Nations High
réfugiés
Commissioner for Human
a
Rights
recensé plus de
has
80
recorded
millions de
more than
personnes
80
déracinées
million
à l'échelle
people
globale,
uprooted throughout
parmi
the
lesquels
world. These
près de
include almost
30 millions
30
sont des
million
réfugiés
who are
et demandeurs
refugees
d'asile.
or asylum
Il
seekers.
s'agit là d'une
This
crise
is a
humanitaire
humanitarian
dont
crisis,
l'ampleur interpelle
the scale of
la
which
conscience
should
humaine.
be of concern to everyone.
Pour trouver une solution
In order to
durable
find
au
a
problème
lasting
migratoire,
solution to the issue of migration,
il faut s'attaquer
there's
aux
a need to
causes
tackle the
profondes des
root causes
déplacements
of human
humains.
displacement.
J'invite la communauté
I would
internationale
urge the international
à
community
renforcer de façon
to
urgente
strengthen
les
urgently
mesures pour
measures
améliorer les
to
conditions
improve
d'existence
living
dans les pays
conditions
pourvoyeurs
in the
de
countries
réfugiés
of
politiques
origin
ou
of
économiques.
political or economic
Pour y
refugees.
parvenir,
In order to do this,
les États partis
states
doivent
parties
se réengager
must recommit
en faveur des
to the
principes
fundamental
fondamentaux
principles
de la
of the
Convention de 1951
1951
et
Convention.
retrouver ensemble,
Together,
dans un
we
esprit
must
de
find in a
coopération,
spirit of
les
cooperation
voies et
the
moyens
best
les
ways
plus
and
appropriés
means
pour veiller à
of
ce que les
ensuring
droits des
that the
réfugiés
rights
soient
of
respectés et
refugees be
protégés.
respected and protected.
Ces derniers jours,
Over recent days,
les images
the images
du traitement
of
réservé
the
à
way
plusieurs de mes
many of
compatriotes à
my
la frontière entre le
compatriots have
Mexique et les
been
États-Unis
handled
ont
at the
choqué
border
plus d'un.
between Mexico and the United
Sans
States
vouloir
have
contester le droit
shocked
d'un
many
État
people.
souverain
We do not wish
de
to
contrôler
challenge the right of a
l'accession
sovereign state to
d'étrangers à son
control
territoire
the entry of
ou
foreigners
de
into its
renvoyer
territory
dans leur
or
pays
to
d'origine
send
ceux
back
qui
to
pénètrent
their
illégalement.
country of origin those who
Nous
enter the
croyons que
country
beaucoup de pays
illegally.
aujourd'hui
However,
prospères
we believe that
ont
many
été
countries which
construits
are prosperous
par des
today
vagues
have been
successives
built
de
through
migrants
successive
et de
waves of
réfugiés.
migrants and refugees.
Ce problème des
The
migrants
issue
doit
of
nous rappeler
migrants must remind
que
us
les êtres
that
humains,
human beings,
les pères et les mères de
fathers
famille
and mothers who
vont
have children are
toujours fuir la
always
misère et les
going
conflits
to flee
et
poverty
chercher
and
à offrir
conflicts.
de meilleures
They will
conditions de
always
vie
strive
à
to
leur
offer
progéniture.
better living standards to their
Les migrations vont
children.
continuer. Tant
Migration
qu'il y
will
aura sur notre
continue as
planète
long
des zones de
as our
prospérité,
planet has
tandis
both
que la
wealthy
majeure partie de la
areas,
population
whilst
mondiale
most of the
vit dans la
population
précarité,
of the world's
parfois
population indeed
extrême,
lives in
sans
poverty,
perspective
even
de
extreme
vie.
poverty, without any
prospects of a better
Monsieur le
life.
Président,
Mr. President,
il est à rappeler que la
it should
diplomatie
be recalled that multilateral
multilatérale, dans le cadre
diplomacy,
de
as
l'Organisation
part
des
of the United
Nations Unies,
Nations Organization,
façonne notre
has
monde
shaped
de
our world for more than 75 years. It is increasingly an indispensable center for relations between states. Indeed,
si des progrès considérables ont été réalisés par
progress has been made vis-à-vis the initial aspirations of international peace and security and for justice and prosperity for all,
c'est grâce à l'engagement
it is thanks to
un
the
système
collective
permanent de
commitment
dialogue et de
undertaken
concertation
and a
que les
permanent system
acteurs
of dialogue
étatiques
and
parviennent
consultation
généralement
that
à des
state
solutions
actors have broadly
négociées pour résoudre leurs différends.
engaged in order to find
Toutefois,
negotiated solutions to
beaucoup reste
resolve their
encore à
differences.
faire
Nonetheless,
pour
much remains
parvenir
to be
à ce
done
monde
to
idéal que
achieve
nous
this
appelons
ideal
tous de nos
world
vœux.
that we all so
À ce
deeply long
égard,
for. To this
aujourd'hui,
end, today,
plus que jamais,
more than ever,
nous avons besoin
we
de
need
renforcer
to
le
bolster
système
our multilateral system
multilatéral et le rendre
and make
plus
it
solidaire
more
et
robust
plus efficace.
and more effective.
Fidèle à cette tradition
Loyal
historique,
to our historic
la République
traditions,
d'Haïti
the Republic of
réitère
Haiti
son
would like to
engagement et
reiterate
sa
its
volonté
commitment and its
de continuer à
desire
œuvrer aux
to
côtés des
continue
États
to
membres
work
de la
alongside
communauté
member states of the
internationale
international community
désireux de
to
bâtir
build
un ordre
a
mondial
fairer
plus juste
and
et
more
plus équitable.
equitable world order.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
Monsieur le Secrétaire
Mr. Secretary
Général,
General,
Excellences,
Excellencies,
Mesdames, Messieurs les
ladies and gentlemen
ambassadeurs,
ambassadors,
distingués délégués.
distinguished delegates.
Cela fait un peu plus de
A
2
little
mois
more than 2
depuis que
months ago,
j'assume
I
la
took
fonction
up
de
my
Premier
post as
ministre
Prime
en
Minister
l'absence du
in
président
the absence
Moïse,
of President
qui
Moïse,
m'a fait l'honneur
who
de me
honored
désigner
me
à ce
by
poste
appointing me to the
seulement
post
quelques
just a
jours
few
avant
days
son
before
horrible
his
assassinat.
horrific assassination.
Dès que j'ai pris la
As
tête
soon
du
as I
gouvernement,
became head of
mon souci
government,
principal a
my
été de tout
main
mettre en œuvre
concern was to do
pour faire
everything in my
revenir
power to
mon
ensure
pays
that as
dans
soon
les
as
meilleurs délais
possible,
possibles,
my
un
country's
fonctionnement
democratic
normal
institutions
des
functioned again
institutions
normally.
C'était le vœu du
This
président
was
Moïse.
the desire
Et
of
c'est
President
l'objectif
Moïse.
qui a guidé
It is the
jusqu'ici
goal
et
which
qui
has guided
continuera
me
de
to
guider
date
mes
and will
actions.
continue to guide my action.
Certains d'entre vous ne le savent
Some
peut-être pas,
of you perhaps are not
mais
aware
je
of
suis appelé
this,
à
but I
gouverner
have been called to
alors
govern
que la quasi-totalité
whilst
des institutions démocratiques
practically
n'existent
none
plus
of
ou sont
our democratic
totalement
institutions
dysfonctionnelles.
exist anymore
Face à une telle situation,
or are totally dysfunctional.
et dans le
Given
souci
such a
de résoudre les
situation
problèmes
and
politiques
seeking
majeurs
to resolve
auxquels le
the
pays est
major
confronté,
political challenges that
notamment
face my country, in
l'insécurité
particular
insupportable,
intolerable insecurity,
le dysfonctionnement du pouvoir
a
législatif,
dysfunctioning legislative
la
branch,
faiblesse
and
caractérisée du
the
système judiciaire,
weakness of the judicial
j'ai dû
system.
former rapidement un
Given all this,
gouvernement
I had to
en
swiftly
vue de
form a
prendre en main
government
les
in
affaires de
order,
l'État.
in order to take government's
Mais
matters
il était
into
évident
hand. But it's
que
clear
seul un dialogue
that
avec les partis
only
politiques
through
et les acteurs
dialogue with
organisés de la
political
société
parties
civile
and
pouvait
civil society
permettre de
stakeholders,
dégager
only
un
through
consensus
this can
suffisant
a
en
sufficient
vue
consensus
d'assurer
be
la
achieved in order
stabilité
to ensure
sociopolitique.
socio-political stability.
C'est dans cet esprit
With
que
this in
depuis
mind,
mon arrivée à la tête du gouvernement,
since I became head of
j'ai
government, I
multiplié des
have
rencontres et
stepped
des
up meetings
discussions
and
avec tous les
discussions
secteurs de
with
la vie
a very
nationale
varied array
indistinctement
of national stakeholders
pour créer un
in
climat
order to
sociopolitique
create a
apaisé,
peaceful socio-economic climate.
indispensable
This
à
is crucial
l'organisation d'élections
in terms of
générales
organizing
crédibles,
a
transparentes
credible,
et
transparent,
inclusives dans les
and
meilleurs délais.
inclusive general
À mon
election as
sens,
soon as possible.
il est indispensable
It is
de
my belief that
retourner
it's
à un fonctionnement
crucial
normal
to
des
ensure
institutions en
that
remettant la direction
institutions
du pays
functioning
à
normally
des
again
élus jouissant
by
de la
handing
confiance de la
leadership of the
population.
country to elected officials who
Il y
enjoy
a
the
quelques
trust of the
jours,
population.
le journal
Just a few
officiel
days
a
ago,
publié
the official journal
l'accord
published
politique pour
the
une
political
gouvernance
agreement
apaisée
for
et
a peaceful
efficace
and
de la
effective
période
government
intérimaire
during the transition
que j'ai
period.
négocié et
I
signé
negotiated and
avec des
signed
acteurs
this
majeurs de la classe
with the
politique,
major
de
stakeholders
nombreuses
of our political
organisations
class, as
populaires
well as
et de la
numerous
société
civil
civile de tendances
society
diverses.
organizations of all stripes.
Cet accord prévoit la
This
création d'un
agreement
environnement
plans for
sécuritaire
the creation
apte
of
à
a security
favoriser une
environment
large
that can foster
participation des citoyens et
broad
des
participation
citoyennes
of
aux prochaines élections.
citizens in the
Il
forthcoming
met en
elections.
place un
It
mécanisme
sets
qui
up
oblige
a
le
mechanism
gouvernement à être
whereby the
transparent
government has to be
et à rendre
transparent
compte.
and accountable.
Tous les secteurs de la vie
All
nationale
these sectors of
auront
national
leur mot
life
à
will
dire
have their say
dans l'élaboration d'une
in
constitution
drafting a
qui sera
constitution
adoptée
that will be
après une
adopted
consultation
after
populaire.
a widespread
Il s'agit là
consultation process.
d'une étape importante
This is an important
dans le
stage
processus de
in the
rétablissement de l'état
process
de
of
droit et
re-establishing
des
the rule of
institutions
law
démocratiques.
and democratic institutions.
Malgré cette large
Despite this
participation,
broad
nous
participation,
restons ouverts
we remain
pour
open
poursuivre
to
les
continue
discussions
discussions
afin
in
d'étendre
order
le
to
consensus.
achieve
Nous voulons
consensus.
obtenir
We want
l'adhésion
to
d'autres
ensure
compatriotes
that other
à ce
fellow
projet
countrymen
commun
are on board
visant à
with
faire
this shared
prendre à notre
project,
pays
which
un
seeks to
nouveau
give
départ.
our country a new start.
J'ai commencé les discussions avec les
I
signataires de
started
l'accord
discussions with the
dans le
signatories to the
cadre de sa
agreement
mise en
as to
application
its implementation.
et je dois les
And I
poursuivre
will
dans les jours qui
continue
viennent.
these discussions over the
J'ai
next
choisi
few
la voie la
days.
plus rapide
I have opted
pour aller
for
vers des
the
élections
quickest
libres,
path towards free,
transparentes,
transparent,
inclusive et non
and
partisanes.
non-partisan elections.
Certains souhaitent une
Some
transition plus
want
longue,
a longer transition
mais
period,
avec beaucoup d'autres,
but along with
je
many
crois
others,
que
I
ce n'est
believe
pas la bonne
that that is
formule.
not the right
Je ne
option.
désespère pas de
I have
convaincre
not given up hope
ceux qui sont
of
encore
convincing
réticents à
those who
rejoindre
are still
les
reluctant
signataires de
to
l'accord
join the
mentionné
signatories of this
pour que nous
agreement
allions ensemble
so that we
dans la
can
paix
move
et
forward
dans le dialogue
together,
permanent
seeking
vers des
peace
solutions
and ongoing
durables aux
dialogue
problèmes de notre
towards
pays.
lasting solutions facing our country.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
à la crise politique
over and above the
que je viens de
political
décrire
crisis
brièvement
that I have just briefly
s'ajoutent
described,
les conséquences des
there's
catastrophes
also the
naturelles
impact
à répétition.
of repeated natural
Haïti est
disasters.
classé parmi les pays les
Haiti
plus
is
vulnérables
ranked one of the
aux
most
désastres
vulnerable
naturels.
countries to natural
Après une
disasters.
série de catastrophes
There was a
meurtrières
series
et
of
dévastatrices,
deadly,
dont le
devastating
séisme de
disasters,
2010
including the
et
2010
l'ouragan Matthew
earthquake
de 2016,
and Hurricane Matthew
qui ont
of
frappé durement le
2016
pays,
that hit the country
un
hard.
puissant tremblement de terre
They were
de
followed by a
7.2
powerful
a
7.2
ravagé
scale
le
earthquake,
14 août
which wrought
dernier
havoc
toute la
on
presqu'île du
the
sud de la
entire
République
southern
d'Haïti.
peninsula of the Republic of Haiti on the 14th of August
Selon les
this
chiffres
year.
officiels
According
disponibles,
to the available
nous avons
official
enregistré
figures,
au moins
we have seen
2207 décès
at least
et 344 personnes
2,207 deaths,
disparues.
344 people
Plus de
are still
12
missing, and more
268
than
blessés. Des milliers de
12,268
maisons sont
people have been
détruites ou
injured.
endommagées,
Thousands of
ainsi que
people
des hôpitaux,
thousands
des
of houses
écoles,
rather have either
des
been
églises,
destroyed
des
or
ponts,
damaged,
des
as well as hospitals, schools, churches,
Je veux saisir
bridges,
cette
and
occasion
roads. I'd like to take this
pour saluer
opportunity
à nouveau
to
l'élan spontané
commend
de
once
solidarité
again
de la
the
communauté
spontaneous
internationale
outpouring of
qui s'est
solidarity
mobilisée
from the international
rapidement
community
aux côtés des
that
autorités
swiftly
établies
mobilized with our
pour
authorities
apporter aide et
to provide
assistance aux
assistance
victimes.
and aid to the victims.
Nous avons
We
apprécié
greatly appreciated
la visite de la
the
secrétaire
visit
générale
of the
adjointe des
United
Nations Unies,
Nations Deputy Secretary
Madame
General,
Amina
Madam
Mohamed,
Amina Mohamed.
qui s'est rendue dans les zones
She went to
affectées
the areas
peu de
affected
temps après le désastre
just shortly after the
pour bien
disaster
mesurer l'ampleur des dégâts
to
et avoir une meilleure
assess
évaluation
properly the
des
scale
besoins réels
of the damage
des
and to have a
personnes
better
touchées.
understanding
Je
of
ne
the real
cite pas
needs of
tous les
the
pays et
people
toutes les
affected. I'm
organisations
not
qui
going
nous sont
to
venus en
quote
aide
all those
de peur d'en
countries
oublier.
and organizations
Mais
that came and
sachez
helped us in case
que
I
tous
forget
ont
someone,
droit
but I
à
wish to be
notre
clear
reconnaissance.
that they all deserve our gratitude.
Qu'il me soit permis d'inviter la
I would
communauté
like to urge the
internationale
international community
à rester collectivement
to
engagée
remain
aux
collectively
côtés d'Haïti
engaged
afin de
alongside
l'aider à
Haiti
répondre
to help it,
non seulement aux
to
besoins
help it to
humanitaires
respond not
immédiats,
only to its
mais
immediate
également
humanitarian needs,
pour
but also
l'accompagner
to
dans le
assist
processus
it
de
in the
reconstruction
reconstruction
sur lequel
process
mon gouvernement travaille.
upon which my government is working.
J'ai lancé avec nos partenaires
Along
techniques
with
et
our technical
financiers
and financial partners,
un
I
PDNA,
have started a
Post-Disaster Need
post-disaster
Assessment.
needs assessment, a PDNA.
Nous devrions recevoir dans les prochaines
We
semaines une
should, over the next
évaluation
few weeks,
exhaustive
receive an
des besoins
exhaustive
pour
needs
engager la
assessment
reconstruction.
of our needs in order to
Il nous faut
undertake
reconstruire
reconstruction.
mieux
There's a need to
et de
build
façon
back
plus
better
résiliente
and in a
pour
more
mieux
resilient
résister
way
aux aléas
to
climatiques
better cope
et aux
with
catastrophes
climate
naturelles en général. Là
hazards
encore,
and natural
nous
disasters in
comptons sur
general.
votre solidarité
Once again,
agissante,
we are banking
tant à
upon your
travers les
proactive
mécanismes
assistance,
existants
both through existing
que par le
mechanisms
biais
and also
de
through
nouveaux engagements.
new commitments.
L'accent mis sur la
The
reconstruction de la
focus
presqu'île du
on
Sud
the reconstruction of the
ne
Southern
peut
Peninsula
ni ne doit nous faire oublier
cannot and
que
must not not make us forget the fact that fighting poverty and creating wealth, these are some of the main priorities for my government.
Nous allons continuer à travailler pour créer un environnement favorable pour une reprise de l'économie et pour attirer des investissements internationaux et étrangers. Notre population est jeune. Elle a besoin d'emplois décents et de meilleures perspectives d'avenir. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, nous avons besoin d'un système multilatéral plus solide et plus efficace afin de permettre aux États membres de l'organisation de développer des stratégies conjointes pour relever ces défis majeurs dans le cadre d'une vision holistique d'un monde meilleur pour tous, en réaffirmant notre engagement collectif en faveur d'un multilatéralisme fort et toujours honnête. Je ne saurais terminer sans inviter les pays membres à considérer les aspirations de la République de Chine-Taïwan qui veut et qui peut jouer un rôle non négligeable dans les initiatives de notre organisation visant à préserver la paix et la sécurité internationale, à promouvoir la coopération et le développement entre les nations. Pour conclure, je rappellerai que le multilatéralisme s'est affirmé au cours de plus de 3/4 de siècle comme un mécanisme incontournable des relations entre les États. L'Organisation des Nations Unies demeure le principal instrument intergouvernemental et universel pour construire ensemble un monde plus juste, plus pacifique, plus fraternel. Faisons en sorte qu'elle puisse continuer à jouer son rôle de forum des peuples des Nations Unies où, ensemble, nous pourrons apporter des solutions communes à nos problèmes communs. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre, ministre des Affaires sociales et du Travail de la République d'Haïti pour l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia to introduce an address by the head of government.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor and privilege to introduce the Honorable Datuk Sri Ismail Sabri Yaakob, Prime Minister of Malaysia. Thank you.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I join others in congratulating you, Mr. President, on your election as President of 76th session of the UN General Assembly. I would also like to thank His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir for his dedication and leadership in successfully completing the work of the last session, which was done under difficult circumstances due to the prevailing COVID-19 pandemic. Malaysia welcomes the theme of this year's General Assembly, Building Resilience through Hope, to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainably, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of the people, and revitalize the United Nations. The theme serves as a stark reminder of what needs to be done and the long road we have before us. Mr. President, Malaysia is fully committed in managing, overcoming, and recovering from this deadly pandemic. No one is safe unless everyone is safe. We must fight this battle together. Our common mission in these unprecedented times call us to recognize that humankind is one big extended family. It is in that spirit that we in Malaysia have very consciously referred to ourselves as Keluarga Malaysia. Together, and putting aside our differences, we'll protect life and livelihoods. We will ensure that Malaysia will not only bounce back, but will thrive as the world emerges from the depth of the pandemic. But, Mr. President, I'm not here to only speak about Malaysia. I'm here to call for us to work together in the spirit of a world family to address the deep-rooted challenges of inequality, political instability, and global governance. Last year, the international community came together with a pledge to fight COVID-19 hand in hand. With our unified commitment, with the aggressive rollout of vaccine, and with the sharing and adoption of best practices, we should have been on our way to recovery. Sadly, the reality today is that we are far from winning the war against this deadly virus. Our relief that vaccines were developed in record time was quickly followed by distress at its discriminatory rollout. While most vaccine-producing nations, as well as those that have the financial means, have achieved some measure of success, the majority of the world's population, mainly from the middle income and least developed countries, remain unvaccinated. Nevertheless, our focus should not just be on vaccines. There are other aspects of health and require our attention. Many health challenges transcend national borders. COVID-19 is just the latest challenge besetting us. Before that, the international community had to deal with other serious outbreaks which had their unique security and socio-economic dimension. With the growing frequency of global health threats, this world family must come together and engage in more effective health diplomacy. We must ensure greater collaboration, not just to end this pandemic, but on an array of other health-related issues. These include expanding the public health capacity of nations, particularly by enhancing their access to relevant technology and knowledge. We truly need to regard public health as a global public good rather than the exclusive domain of individual nations. It is because of this that Malaysia will play a more prominent role and participate more actively in health diplomacy, and our approach will be more interdisciplinary in nature and involve more relevant stakeholders. As for COVID-19, we cannot afford to wait for an even deadlier variant to emerge and claim more life. We need to act now. Mr. President, the path towards achieving the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was never easy to begin with. Yet, we have made steady progress. COVID-19 has, however, reversed many hard-won gains. The pandemic has amplified pre-existing inequalities and uncertainties. It has widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Varying degrees of shortfalls in governance and social security have driven populations back into poverty. Needless to say, we are further away from achieving the 2030 Agenda now than we were before. Like the rest of the world, Malaysia's economy has not been spared. In 2020, Malaysia's GDP contracted by 5.6%. This marks the worst decline in more than 20 years since the Asian financial crisis. From the beginning of the pandemic, Malaysia took a whole of government and whole of society approach in addressing this unprecedented crisis. We executed a clear strategy with focus on three thrusts. Firstly, we expanded our healthcare delivery system to prevent the spread and tend to the infected. Secondly, we provided strategic fiscal injections to safeguard the economy. And thirdly, we protected the people's livelihood. In doing so, we introduced economic stimulus package worth about 130 billion USD, or 36% of our GDP. We ensured inclusive growth by addressing poverty while providing a social safety net to protect vulnerable groups. These packages also play an important role in assisting enterprises to remain afloat during these difficult times. Almost 2 years into the pandemic, we realized that we need to balance between keeping our people safe while protecting their livelihoods. As such, Malaysia introduced the National Recovery Plan as the nation's exit strategy from the pandemic. This includes speeding up vaccination rates, which stand at more than 500,000 doses daily in recent weeks. It also includes reopening key economic sectors to revive the economy. We are pleased that these efforts, as well as our pursuit in attaining the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, were commended during our voluntary national review in July this year. That said, rebuilding lives and economies after the pandemic will not come easy. The challenges are even greater for countries that are more vulnerable to natural disasters. Recovery efforts will certainly be more difficult and thus require more time and resources to take effect. For Malaysia, mainstreaming sustainability is key in ensuring a smooth transition to a greener socio-economic ecosystem. We have set ambitious plans to facilitate the transition to a more sustainable, low-carbon, and climate-resilient future. We have introduced policies, including the concept of circular economy, which will drive mitigation and adaptation initiatives in our cities. We are confident that they will greatly contribute towards making Malaysia's low-carbon nation by 2050. At the same time, developed countries have the responsibility to provide financial resources and technology transfer to the developing world to undertake sustainable initiatives. This is in line with the equity principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Mr. President, the development and deployment of nuclear weapons continues to be a threat to all mankind. Given the global health crisis, we find it disheartening that billions of dollars are being spent to maintain and modernize nuclear weapons rather than on saving life and livelihood. Malaysia supports the total elimination of nuclear weapons and the assurance that they will never be produced again. This is the only guarantee against the catastrophic consequences arising from their use. Towards this end, Malaysia welcomes the coming into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, earlier this year. Malaysia reaffirms its commitment to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, and as chair of Main Committee 1 on Nuclear Disarmament for the 10th NPT Review Conference, we will strive towards bringing state parties together and do our best to steer deliberations towards a fruitful outcome. Mr. President, Malaysia has always been a firm believer in all efforts and initiatives that promote peaceful coexistence between nations, between different peoples, and between different faiths and cultures. As a multicultural, multiracial, and multi-religious country, Malaysia strongly believes that we have been practicing can also be applied to the entire world. At the same time, we are a strong proponent of multilateralism. Both multilateralism and peaceful coexistence are mutually reinforcing. We need to realize that as we progress further, we should be far more integrated and stronger as a family of nations. Respect and mutual understanding must be the backbone and essence in our interactions and discourse. We believe that diversity can be a powerful source of strength and resilience. Thus, we need to take a deeper look at the many qualities that make up our family of nations. It is no longer enough that we tolerate differences, but we should instead learn to celebrate and treat them with genuine curiosity and meaningful respect. Amid the global uncertainties, it is time for us to work and strengthen our efforts towards living together in peace and harmony. As such, Malaysia will continue to do what it can in promoting peace and preventing conflict in the conduct of its foreign policy. With this approach, Malaysia will continue to uphold its fundamental principles of defending the nation's sovereignty and interests, maintaining good relations, including promoting tolerance, mutual respect, and understanding among all peoples and actors of all nations. As a member state of ASEAN, Malaysia is committed in preserving ASEAN region as a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality, ZOFAN. Malaysia also reaffirms its commitment towards global peace, security and prosperity by continuing to lead on the issuance of a joint communique on global ceasefire in June this year. We strongly believe that the UN membership must speak with one voice on the need for an immediate cessation of hostilities in all corners of the world. This would allow governments and all stakeholders to focus their attention on combating humankind's deadliest enemy. Nevertheless, Mr. President, it is unfortunate that we are far from realizing this global ceasefire. Many places are still experiencing instability. The situation in Myanmar remains of grave concern. Malaysia cannot emphasize enough the importance of respecting the will and interests of the people of Myanmar. This is a need for a peaceful solution to be found, especially with a multitude of challenges besetting the country. Malaysia is particularly worried about the humanitarian situations now further aggravated by Myanmar's healthcare system, which is stretched thin. It is absolutely essential for aid to reach those in need. Equally troubling is the refugee crisis that has engulfed Myanmar since the mass exodus of Rohingya in 2017. Malaysia currently hosts more than 150,000 refugees from Myanmar, comprising 86% of the refugee population in the country. More than 66% of those are from the Rohingya ethnic minority, and this is just a conservative estimate. ASEAN member states have taken steps to engage key parties of this conflict to extend assistance where possible. Malaysia fully supports the work of the ASEAN Chair's Special Envoy on Myanmar. However, we remain concerned that the authorities have yet to allow ASEAN Special Envoy to visit the country. We urge the authorities to accept the visit and assist the Special Envoy in his duties, as well as expedite the implementation of the 5-point consensus. Mr. President, on the occupied Palestinian territory, OPT, Malaysia is appalled by the deaths of many Palestinian civilians, including women and children, following the brutal attacks by Israel in May this year. We strongly condemn repeated violations and aggressions by Israeli forces and settlers against Palestinian worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque. The targeted aggression against worshippers is indeed contemptuous to all Muslims or for any peace-loving religion. In fact, let us be truly frank about what is happening in the OPT. The systematic oppression of Palestinians over many years through discriminatory policies, denial of basic civil rights, imposition of harsh conditions, large-scale land confiscation, and inhumane acts committed against them is tantamount to the crime of apartheid. Yes, Mr. President, apartheid still exists in this world, and most of us are just turning a blind eye to this. Malaysia stresses again that Israel must be held responsible and accountable for all its wrongdoing, including its flagrant violations of international law. We welcome the establishment of an international commission of inquiry by the Human Rights Council to investigate violations of international human rights law during the 11th day crisis. Malaysia continues to call for the deployment of a temporary international presence in the city of Al-Quds to monitor the cessation of hostilities in the OPT. The international community must spare no effort to ensure the safety, protection, dignity, and well-being of the Palestinian civilian population. While generations have had to endure this oppression, it is time that we pay attention to the voices and roles of the younger generation of Palestinians. It is time to give them a better future. They have been suffering in dreadful living conditions under illegal Israeli occupation for so many years, and we cannot allow this to continue indefinitely. Malaysia has and will continue to lend its unwavering support and solidarity to the Palestinians. Turning to the situation in Afghanistan, Malaysia is appalled by the terrorist attack outside the Hamid Karzai International Airport last month. The attack resulted in the loss of innocent lives, with many more injured. Malaysia expresses its deepest condolences to the bereaved families of the victims. We also wish those injured a full recovery. Malaysia condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. The region cannot be allowed to be turned into a fertile breeding ground for terrorism again. The world family must come together to support Afghanistan in this time of need, including by extending humanitarian assistance to the people. On this, Malaysia stands ready to extend its assistance and do what it can. Mr. President, the UN has been in existence for over 75 years. In that time, the world has changed significantly. As such, the UN must keep pace with a rapidly changing world as it continues to face a crisis of expectations. Reform is necessary to strengthen the UN's effectiveness as a multilateral organization, to bring more transparency to it and to enhance its credibility. On this, we must work together to reform the organizations, and we hope member states will demonstrate openness, flexibility, and political will in the interest of international peace, security, and prosperity. Mr. President, during its inception, we looked to the United Nations to save humanity from the scourge of war. Today, we place our resolve in the UN and its member state to save humanity from the scourge of the global pandemic. The pandemic has shown that we need to improve our resolve to strengthen international cooperation and multilateralism and consider ourselves as a family of nations. At the same time, the world family must be made a more peaceful, prosperous, sustainable, and equitable one. We must close ranks and enhance our unity and cohesion. We must live in peaceful coexistence. Only then we will have a chance to succeed. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of Malaysia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic to introduce an address by the head of government.
Mr. President, it is my distinct honor to introduce a pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Pankang Vipawan, Prime Minister of the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, at the outset, on behalf of the delegation of the Lao PDR, I would like to congratulate you, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, on your election as President of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I am confident that with your extensive diplomatic experience, you will be able to lead the deliberation to a great success. Taking this opportunity, I would also like to commend His Excellency Mr. Wolfgang Bosquier for his successful presidency of the 75th session of the UNGA. Mr. President, it has been almost 2 years now that we have learned about and lived with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has claimed more than 4.5 million lives around the world and posed unprecedented pressure on our healthcare system, disrupted the global economic chain, made more people poor, hindered physical interaction between people, and created disorder and mutual mistrust. Although this kind of situation had occurred before in human history, but what we are encountering now is considered the most severe crisis and remains unpredictable for how long we will eventually overcome it. Nonetheless, the last 2 years have given us many lessons learned. The key lesson we have drawn from is to uphold a genuine cooperation among all in local and international community. This unity, prejudice, and mutual antagonism will not only make us succumb to COVID-19, but it could further bring about catastrophe for humanity. Lessons from the pandemic have taught us that where there is unity, mutual cooperation, and support, there the success on containing COVID-19 prevails. Mr. President, I am delighted to observe that during the span of COVID-19 pandemic, the international community has attached great attention and has been determined to combat and contain COVID-19 pandemic. This issue has become an international agenda at all fora, be it at bilateral or multilateral levels, where preventive measures and solutions are discussed and agreed upon. This has given us encouragement and impetus to triumph over the COVID-19 pandemic in the near future. The global commitment toward enhanced cooperation has clearly been translated into practical actions, such as information and lessons learned sharing, and execution of various preventive measures, including provision of medical supports, vaccines, and medicines, as well as adoption of mitigation measures to address the social and economic impacts from the outbreak of COVID-19. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the government as well as the people of the Lao PDR to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the international community, the friendly countries, including international organizations, for rendering assistance to the Lao PDR in various areas, which enable our country to contain the outbreak at a manageable level. This is a reflection of effective concrete assistance and genuine cooperation of the international community, and I hope that the Lao PDR will continue to receive further support in the future. Mr. President, although the fight against COVID-19 pandemic in many countries has gained a positive momentum, however, if we do not continue our enhanced cooperation and mutual assistance, be it at the political or technical levels, we would hardly overcome this crisis. Against this backdrop, I would like to urge the international community, particularly the countries with advanced medical science, and all scientists worldwide to make concerted efforts in combating COVID-19, especially in research and development of vaccines, medicines, including cooperation on COVID-19 origin tracing. We should avoid blame game and politicization of COVID-19 issue that may lead to political discourse. We are enthusiastic to see all medical scientists around the world coming to work closely together in finding ways to protect people's lives without discrimination. On another note, throughout the past 2 years, COVID-19 has destroyed global economic chain, forcing every country in the world into economic recession and stagnation. It has created direct impacts on socio-economic development of every country, especially developing and least developed countries, including the Lao PDR. The progress made prior to COVID-19 in the implementation of international commitments, namely the Sustainable Development Goals, and others, have been undermined. Moreover, the ability and capacity of these countries to recover from this impact has been minimal In this regard, I would like to call on the international community, particularly the developed countries, to give importance to and pay attention on enhancing assistance to the developing and least developed countries in order to enable them to overcome the impacts from COVID-19. Mr. President, as mentioned above, Lao PDR, like many other countries, has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The national economic growth, as well as progress made in the implementation of the National Socio-Economic Development Plan, have significantly been undermined despite the efforts made by the Lao government, such as adopting the short and long-term measures, which include the integration of SDGs into the 5-year National Socio-Economic Development Plan, as well as the Development Strategy 2025 and the Vision 2030. Furthermore, there has been an effort to implement the Istanbul Program of Action, with an ambition to lift the country out of the least developed country status in the near future. Although Lao PDR successfully met all the 3 criteria for graduation from LDC status in the second review in February 2021, we still have concerns over the impacts of COVID-19 that may impair Lao PDR's competence to remain on track in all the 3 established criteria. Under these difficult and challenging circumstances, nevertheless, Lao government has continued its effort to implement its 9th 5-year National Socio-Economic Development Plan from 2021 to 2025 that was recently adopted by the National Assembly, while the issue of addressing the economic and financial constraints and the fight against drug was made a national agenda, calling for all walks of life nationwide to effectively implement this national priority. Taking this opportunity, I would like to request the international community to consider their continued support and assistance to the government and people of the Lao PDR, so as to make our goal as well as our national agenda a reality. Mr. President, in the regional cooperation context, Lao PDR has actively participated and contributed with great responsibility under the framework of ASEAN, especially in the maintenance and promotion of peace and stability in the region, to create an environment conducive for the development cooperation of ASEAN member states. In addition, ASEAN has attached the importance on the cooperation for the prevention and response to COVID-19, as well as post-COVID-19 economic recovery, aimed at building ASEAN a community with strong foundation for the future by adhering to the principle as stipulated in the ASEAN Charter in the wake of ever-increasing international integration and interdependence. At the same time, Lao PDR is committed to reducing the development disparity and promoting the intra-ASEAN and inter-regional connectivity, putting all efforts in utilizing potentials within the region together with the external ones in the implementation of the 4th Initiative for ASEAN Integration and the Master Plan for ASEAN Connectivity 2025, with a purpose to create an opportunity to promote infrastructure development, poverty reduction, and sustainable development in the region. On this note, the Lao PDR continues its economic infrastructure development in order to efficiently facilitate the regional and sub-regional integration through various cooperation frameworks. One of the milestone events in the coming months is the inauguration of the China-Laos high-speed railway to be held by the end of 2021, which will mark the first ever Lao PDR's railway and the opening of a new era under the Vision to transform a landlocked into land-linked country, so as to further promote the better facilitation of regional trade. Mr. President, in the midst of the current global situations, which are overwhelmed with complexity, conflicts, and different perspectives, Lao PDR still stands solid on its foreign policy for peace, independence, friendship, and cooperation, as well as on the principles of conflict resolution through peaceful means, and non-interference in others' internal affairs, and always believe that peace and security is the ultimate priority and prerequisites for every nation's socio-economic development. Therefore, negotiations by peaceful means and dialogue with sincerity are pivotal in ensuring peace and cooperation. Isolation, confrontation, and unilateral sanctions imposed on one country bring no benefit for any parties involved and the international community at large. In our continued support, along with the world community, we urge the lifting economic embargo on the Republic of Cuba, aimed at enabling the country to contain the outbreak of COVID-19 and sustain self-development, to be able to carry out economic, trade, and investment cooperation with other countries without any restriction in order to bring about tangible benefits for the people in this country and in the region. The prolonged Israeli and Palestinian conflict over many decades has resulted in great loss of lives and properties for the Palestinians and Israeli, of which it should have been solved by peaceful means. The Lao PDR once again calls for the relevant parties to resume dialogues and mutual trust building for solving the issue, aimed at accomplishing the establishment of two sovereign states of Palestine and Israel, peacefully coexisting under the relevant UN resolution. Mr. President, Lao PDR has attached the importance of addressing climate change by integrating the commitment under the Paris Agreement into its National Socio-Economic Development Plan and the National Green Growth Strategy. From 2000 to 2020, the greenhouse gas emission by Lao PDR has been lowered by 34% in comparison with the baseline emission. Furthermore, the government has presented a nationally determined contribution on climate change to the United Nations, in which it targets to reduce 60% of the greenhouse gas emission by 2030. This is another remarkable step of the Lao PDR in contribution to tackling climate change issue and upholding its commitment under the Paris Agreement. In this regard, Lao PDR sincerely urged all countries around the world to reinforce their efforts to realize the Paris Agreement commitment in order to prevent and minimize the occurrence of severe natural disasters and devastating impacts on our planet. Mr. President, I have a firm confidence that the upholding of multilateralism, conflict resolution through peaceful means, and development cooperation under the UN Charter remain true and relevant mechanism for us to address and battle against the global crisis we are facing, aimed at meeting humanity's common aspiration for a future that all people live in peace and prosperity. The Lao PDR will continue to actively contribute to promoting the cooperation under the United Nations auspices. In this spirit, I would like to reiterate our candidature for membership of the ECOSOC for the term 2023 to 2025. This has clearly demonstrated our utmost determination and readiness to make full and active contribution in the noble task of United Nations. We, therefore, look forward to the support of our candidature from all the UN member states and hope for the opportunity to actively contribute to the work of the Council. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Lao People's Democratic Republic for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Sudan to introduce an address by the head of government.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the distinct honor to introduce to you a pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Adam Hamdouk, the Prime Minister of the Republic of the Sudan. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة أصحاب الجلالة والفخامة، رؤساء الدول والحكومات، السيد الأمين العام، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. سعدنا أن نخاطبكم وقد مضى أكثر من عامين على ثورة ديسمبر المجيدة التي مهرتها دماء السودانيين بكل فئاتهم، فجاءت تعبيرا صادقا عن آمال وتطلعات شعبنا في الحرية والسلام والعدالة. كما يطيب لنا أن نتقدم إليكم بالتهنئة الصادقة سعادة الوزير عبد الله شاهد على انتخابكم رئيسا للجمعية العامة، وتمنينا لكم كل توفيق وسداد، آملين أن تكلل أعمال هذه الدورة بكل نجاح. ولا يفوتنا أن نعرب عن تقديرنا للجهود الكبيرة التي بذلها سلفكم، سعادة السفير فولكان بوسكير رئيس الدولة السابق. تأتي مداولات هذه الدورة وما زالت آثار جائحة كورونا الفتاكة تلقي بظلالها على كافة مناحي الحياة، لا سيما في الدول الفقيرة، وللتصدي لأخطار الفيروس الذي أخذ يظهر بعينات متغيرة في الوقت الذي تكابد فيه دول العالم الفقير لتأمين الحصول على اللقاح اللازم لشعوبها. إن السبيل الوحيد لتحقيق شعار No one is safe until everyone is safe هو سبيل التعاون الدولي وتحكيم آليات العمل متعدد الأطراف، بدءا من توفير اللقاح للدول النامية وانتهاء بإعادة بناء ما خربته الجائحة على أسس تراعى فيها تنفيذ الأطر الاقتصادية الدولية القائمة، وعلى رأسها أجندات التنمية المستدامة بطرائق خلاقة تعتمد على الاستدامة وسلامة البيئة. ومن هذا المنطلق فإننا ندعم شعار هذه الدورة وموضوعها الأساسي والذي غطت عناصره الخمس انشغالات الدول الأعضاء في هذه المنظمة بشكل وافي، كما تغطي كذلك الركائز الثلاث لمنظمتنا الدولية: حفظ الأمن، تحقيق التنمية، وصيانة حقوق الإنسان. وفي سياق مكافحة الجائحة فإننا نجدد دعمنا وتقديرنا لمنظمة الصحة العالمية، ونشيد بدورها الفعال الذي طلعت به خلال تفشي هذه الجائحة منذ بدايتها، والدعم الفني الذي ظلت تقدمه للدول المتأثرة. كما نتقدم بالشكر كل الدول والمنظمات التي قدمت لنا ولسوانا من دول العالم الثالث الدعم والسند في المجال الصحي. سيد الرئيس، تواصل حكومتنا الانتقالية تنفيذ سياساتها الرامية إلى تحقيق التحول الديمقراطي وسيادة حكم القانون وتعزيز أوضاع حقوق الإنسان، بجانب العمل على معالجة التشوهات الهيكلية الموروثة في بنية الاقتصاد السوداني. وتستهدف مجمل هذه البرامج والسياسات بناء سودان آمن مستقر ينعم فيه الجميع بالسلام والرخاء، ويتمتع فيه المواطنون بالحرية والعدالة على النحو الذي عبرت عنه شعارات ثورة ديسمبر المجيدة، حيث أن هذه الإصلاحات قد أثرت على الشرائح الضعيفة في المجتمع، وقد قمنا بتدشين برامج تهدف لتوفير الحماية الاجتماعية من خلال دعم الشرائح الضعيفة، وذلك بمساعدة الشركاء الإقليميين والدوليين. ولا شك أن هذه المعالجات تتطلب دعما من المجتمع الدولي. سيد الرئيس، فيما يتصل بحماية المدنيين وتعزيز أوضاع حقوق الإنسان وسيادة حكم القانون، فإن جهودنا تتواصل لإجراء إصلاحات مؤسسية وقانونية وتعزيز أطر حقوق الإنسان وحمايتها وتحقيق العدالة وفي هذا السياق اتساقا مع الصكوك الإقليمية والدولية قد أنشأنا الآلية الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان والتي ضمت عضويتها جميع الأطراف الوطنية المعنية بحماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان بالبلاد. صادقنا في الأشهر القليلة الماضية الاتفاقية الدولية لحماية جميع الأشخاص من الاختفاء القسري واتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمناهضة التعذيب. إننا عازمون كذلك على مواصلة العمل لتحسين الأوضاع الأمنية في دارفور من خلال تطبيق اتفاقية جوبا للسلام وجمع السلاح وتحقيق العدالة والمحاسبة وتنفيذ الخطة الوطنية لحماية المدنيين بمشاركة أطراف اتفاقية جوبا للسلام. السيد الرئيس، منذ تولي الحكومة الانتقالية للسلطة في السودان انتهجنا سياسة خارجية قوامها الاحترام المتبادل والتعاون، وهدفها المركزي تحقيق المصلحة العليا للسودان وإعلاء قيم حسن الجوار والتعاون الإقليمي، نسينا في ذلك بمبادئ ثورتنا السلمية المجيدة ووثيقتها الدستورية. وعلى صعيد المحور الإنساني فإننا نعرب عن تقديرنا للأمم المتحدة ووكالاتها الإنسانية وكافة المنظمات الدولية مجتمع المانحين على مساندتهم ودعمهم لحكومة الثورة في جهودها لمعالجة أوضاع النازحين واللاجئين والعائدين إلى مواطنهم الأصلية. ونشير في هذا السياق لأن حكومة الثورة قد سارعت أولا برفع كل القيود والعراقيل التي كانت تعيق عمليات إيصال المساعدات الإنسانية للمتأثرين في مناطق النزاعات. وفي إطار هذا المحور فإن الدولة قد عالجت ضمن خطتها الوطنية موضوع تحسين بيئة العمل الإنساني وتوفير متطلباته من خلال تبني مشروعات الحلول المستدامة للنازحين وتوفيق أوضاعهم وفقا لما نصت عليه الصكوك الدولية واللوائح المنظمة للعمل الإنساني. وفي هذا السياق أشير إلى الترتيبات الجارية لعقد اجتماع رفيع المستوى لإيجاد حلول مستدامة للاجئين والنازحين العائدين والمجتمعات المستضيفة، مبادرة من الإيجاد بالتعاون مع المفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة للاجئين. سيد الرئيس، إن قضية اللاجئين تشكل أحد أهم القضايا الاستراتيجية ذات التأثير المباشر على الأمن القومي والاقتصاد والبنية التحتية والقطاع الخدمي بالبلاد. كما تعلمون أن السودان بحكم موقعه بالإضافة لعوامل أخرى ظل ملازا لأعداد كبيرة من اللاجئين من دول الجوار التي تواجه تحديات سياسية وأمنية واقتصادية. تمثل المجتمعات المستضيفة الخط الأول في توفير الحماية والتضامن للاجئين وتتقاسم معهم الموارد رغم محدوديتها، غير أنها لم تحظى بالدعم اللازم، إذ أن وضع اللاجئين بالمعسكرات أفضل بكثير من المجتمعات المستضيفة، مما يستدعي من المجتمع الدولي المساهمة الفاعلة في تنمية هذه المجتمعات في إطار المشاركة في تحمل الأعباء. ونشير هنا إلى أنه على الرغم من إطلاق المفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة للاجئين نداء للمجتمع الدولي في العام الماضي لجمع تمويل لمقابلة الاحتياجات، إلا أن حجم الاستجابة كان دون المطلوب بكثير. ومن هذا المنطلق فإن السودان يناشد الأسرة الدولية وكل المنظمات العاملة في الشأن الإنساني والمانحين لتوفير الدعم اللازم وحشد الموارد لمجابهة التحديات التي يفرضها هذا الوضع الإنساني الطارئ. سيد الرئيس، لا نعلق أهمية كبرى على مسألة سيادة حكم القانون على المستويين الوطني والدولي، ونبذل لذلك جهودا مستمرة لمراجعة القوانين الوطنية بغية تطويرها وضمان اتساقها مع المعايير والاتفاقيات الدولية. وتتوافق هذه الجهود مع مبادرات متعددة بالداخل تنهض بها الجهات ذات الصلة في مجالات بناء وتعزيز القدرات الوطنية وتمكين الأجهزة المختصة من الوفاء بمسؤولياتها ومهامها، باعتبار أن تحقيق سيادة القانون على المستوى الوطني هي مسؤولية الدولة، مسؤولية الدول والحكومات. وفي هذا الإطار سيادة حكم القانون لا سيما في جانبه الإنساني، فقد انضم السودان لعدد من الاتفاقيات والمعاهدات التي تساعد في تحقيق ذلك. على الصعيد الداخلي قمنا باتخاذ عدد من الخطوات الإيجابية لمعالجة التشوهات التي لحقت بملف حقوق الإنسان طيلة فترة الحكم الشمولي السابق. كان في مقدمتها إلغاء عدد من القوانين المقيدة للحريات وتعزيز دور المرأة في المجتمع وحماية حقوقها وحرية الرأي والتعبير والتجمع السلمي ومحاربة ظاهرة الإفلات من العقاب. كما حرصنا على تعزيز التعاون مع المجتمع الدولي، وفي هذا السياق ظل المكتب القطري للمفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان يباشر مهامه في السودان منذ يناير من العام الجاري. سيد الرئيس، ظلت بلادنا وما تزال تساهم بشكل فاعل في دعم استقرار الأوضاع السياسية والأمنية في القارة الأفريقية، لا سيما دول الجوار، وذلك عبر عضويتها الفاعلة في المنظمات الإقليمية والشبه الإقليمية كالاتحاد الأفريقي والجامعة العربية والبحيرات العظمى، الساحل والصحراء والإيجاد. قام السودان من خلال رئاسته للإيجاد ببذل مساعيه ومجهوداته دعما للأمن والسلم في الإقليم، وسعى لحل الخلافات بين دول الإقليم. إن السودان ما بعد الثورة يؤمن بأهمية علاقات حسن الجوار ودعم استتباب الأمن والاستقرار في تلك الدول وعدم التدخل في شؤونها الداخلية. سيد الرئيس، كما تابعتم فقد عقد مجلس الأمن في يوليو المنصرم اجتماعا هو الثاني للمجلس منذ عام حول تطورات ملف سد النهضة الأثيوبي الكبير، في ذات التوقيت الذي أعلنت فيه أثيوبيا عن خطوتها الأحادية بالملء الثاني، وذلك بعد أن عجزت الأطراف خلال جولات التفاوض السابقة عن تحقيق أي اتفاق بسبب التعنت في أمر السد رغم الجهود الكبيرة التي بذلتها رئاسة الاتحاد الأفريقي السابقة والحالية. وفي هذا السياق إننا نجدد موقفنا الرافض لأي إجراء أحادي، ونؤكد على ضرورة التوصل لاتفاق ملزم حول الملء والتشغيل لتجنيب بلادنا الأضرار المحتملة التي تهدد سبل ووسائل العيش نصف سكان السودان، مع تهديد سلامة التشغيل لسبل السودان والتأثير سلبا على ري المشروعات الزراعية ومحطات مياه الشرب، فضلا عن الآثار الاجتماعية والاقتصادية والبيئية على طول مجرى النيل الأزرق ونهر النيل. قد كابدنا بعضا من هذه المضار إبان الملء الأحادي الأول في العام الماضي والملء الأحادي الثاني خلال الأسابيع الماضية، رغم الإجراءات الاحترازية المتعددة والمكلفة التي أجريناها تفاديا لهذه الآثار. إننا نعيد التأكيد على أن وضع ملف سد النهضة أمام مجلس الأمن جاء لتعزيز مسار التفاوض الحالي تحت مظلة الاتحاد الأفريقي بما يمكن من تحقيق الاتفاق المنشود. وهنا نجدد الاستعداد لاستئناف المشاركة في أي مبادرة أو تحرك سلمي يوصل الأطراف إلى اتفاق يلبي مصالح جميع الأطراف. سيد الرئيس، إن السودان رغم توديعه بدماء شهدائه لعقود من البطش والقمع والظلم، ورغم الإنجازات التي تحققت خلال هذه الفترة الوجيزة بعد ثورته المجيدة، إلا أن عملية الانتقال ما زالت تواجه عددا من التحديات الجسام التي تستوجب استمرار دعم المجتمع الدولي والأصدقاء، استكمال خطط الحكومة الرامية لإصلاح الأوضاع الاقتصادية تمر بها البلاد، في مقدمة ذلك إعفاء ديون السودان كافة والحصول على قروض ميسرة، إلى جانب إيفاء الشركاء بتعهداتهم المعلنة خلال مؤتمر شركاء السودان ببرلين في العام الماضي ومؤتمر باريس لدعم السودان خلال هذا العام، وقبل ذلك إسقاط ما تبقى من قيود إجرائية بعد أن اكتمل رفع اسم السودان من قائمة الدول الراعية للإرهاب، حتى تتمكن بلادنا من إكمال عودتها إلى الأسرة الدولية بعد انقطاع قسري استمر ل3 عقود. وفي هذا السياق توجه بأجزل الشكر للسيد الرئيس إيمانويل ماكرون ولفرنسا لتنظيمهم وتبنيهم لمؤتمر باريس، كما توجه بالشكر لكل الدول التي أعلنت إسقاط ديونها عن السودان، وللدول والمنظمات التي دعمت برامج الحماية الاجتماعية امتصاصا للآثار الجانبية لعملية الإصلاح الهيكلي على الشرائح الضعيفة في مجتمعنا. سيد الرئيس، اسمحوا لي أن أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لمنظمة الأمم المتحدة والاتحاد الأفريقي ولبعثة الأمم المتحدة والاتحاد الأفريقي المختلطة بدارفور يوناميد بمناسبة انتهاء مهمتهم في دارفور، مع كثير من الدروس المستفادة والقيمة خروجهم من السودان بعد اكتمال عمليات تسليم مغار البعثة لحكومة السودان والدخول في مرحلة تصفية البعثة النهائية. كما يسعدني أن أحيطكم علما بتوقيع حكومة السودان وبعثة الأمم المتحدة المتكاملة لدعم الانتقال في السودان يونيتامس على اتفاقية وضع البعثة. أود أن أؤكد على التزام حكومة السودان بتقديم التسهيلات والتعاون اللازمين معها لدعم أهدافها. كما أود أن أشيد بالروح الإيجابية التي تتعامل بها بعثة يونيتامس وأدعوها لبذل المزيد من الجهد لتنفيذ تفويضها لمساعدة حكومة السودان لتحقيق عملية الانتقال الديمقراطي وفق مرجعيات ومحاور القرار رقم 2425 المنشئ لولايتها. وبالرغم من أن الحكومة الانتقالية قد خطت إلى حد كبير تحديات تحقيق السلام، إلا أن تحديات ما بعد السلام تظل أكبر، وعليه نأمل أن يلعب المجتمع الدولي ومنظمات الأمم المتحدة وبعثة يونيتامس دورا فاعلا في عملية بناء السلام وعودة النازحين وتوفير الموارد المالية والفنية لعمليات الدمج والتسريح وغيرها من العمليات المرتبطة بتسريع تنفيذ بنود الترتيبات الأمنية كما جاءت في اتفاق سلام جوبا. سيد الرئيس، ختام أرجو التأكيد على أن مسيرتنا ماضية استكمال مشروعات البناء، إصلاحا لمؤسساتنا ونظمنا الداخلية، وتعزيزا لعلاقاتنا الخارجية حتى تكتمل عودة السودان عضوا فاعلا في محيطه الإقليمي والدولي، مشاركا في صناعة المستقبل الذي نريد، ومساهما في تعزيز دور الأمم المتحدة وصولا إلى تعضيد التعاون والعمل الجماعي كمنهج ناجح لمواجهة التحديات التي تهدد شعوبنا. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre de la République du Soudan pour l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. Et je donne maintenant la parole, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, au représentant du Cambodge pour qu'il introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Mr. President, I have the distinct honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by Samdech Akya Mohasena Padai Decho Hun Sen, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Cambodia. Thank you, Mr. President.
អាដាមប្រធានមហាសន្និបាតអង្គការសហប្រជាជាតិអាដាមអង្គការលេខាធិការអង្គការសហប្រជាជាតិ
Secretary General of the United Organization, Excellencies, Madam, Ladies and Gentlemen. At the outset, let me express my heartfelt appreciation to Excellency Volkan Bokir for his past effort to guide the work of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I wish to congratulate as well Excellency Abdullah Shahid for his election as the President of the 76th United Nations General Assembly session. I also have the great pleasure to congratulate His Excellency Antonio Guterres for his second term reappointment as the United Nations Secretary General. This is the second time that the United Nations General Assembly has to hold its session in a virtual setting due to the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 and the surge of its variant are the biggest challenge and the most disruptive event in modern history. Overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic and efforts to restore growth, economic growth have been the top priority for all countries. Cambodia has joined international efforts to roll out a widespread vaccination campaign. Our national campaign was launched on the 10th February 2021, and we have made steady progress, including the vaccination of foreign nationals, children, and youth between 6 to 18 years of age. At this rate, we expect to vaccinate around 80%. It's around 13 million people of the total population of around 60 million by no later than November of this year. With good vaccination progress, in combination with strong containment and treatment measures, Cambodia looks ahead to a gradual reopening of a sustainable and inclusive social and economic activity. We take these opportunities to express our sincere thanks to all our bilateral and multilateral friends for the generous support extended to Cambodia in our fight against COVID-19. Mr. President, our world still has to tackle a myriad of all the present challenges such as geopolitical competition and rivalries between major powers, technological and trade wars, territorial armed conflict, terrorism and transnational crime, and climate change. The pressure on international peace and security is as great as ever. History has told us time and again that interference and wars military option to impose different systems of governance are not the solutions. Far from it, they have only led to many more deaths, human suffering and misery, social and economic strife. Cambodia is the real-life example and has experienced the worst tragedies, and sadly, we are now witnessing the repetition of the same policies. If the recent events in Afghanistan and many more before it are lessons to be learned from, there is great merit to respect the wishes of each nation and their people's right to self-determination. That is why there is now a compelling reason to strengthen multilateralism and rule-based international cooperation. Countries, large or small, differ in their history, culture, tradition, ways of life,
ប្រទេសនីមួយ
and
ៗ
political
ត្រូវ
organization.
បានបង្អាក់ដំណើរដោយសារ
They
តែ
should
ការ
not
ដាក់ទណ្ឌ
be
កម្មជាឯក
hindered
តោភាគី
by the
ការហាម
imposition
ឃាត់
of
ឬវិធានការបង្ខិត
unilateral
បង្ខំ
sanction
ផ្នែកសេដ្ឋកិច្ចផ្សេងទៀត
embargoes
ដែលរំលោភបំ
or
ពានលើ
others
ច្បាប់អន្តរជាតិ
coercive
និង
economic
គោលការ
measures
ណ៍ដែល
that
មានចែង
violate
ក្នុងធម្មនុញ្ញ
international law
នៃអង្គការ
and
សហ
the
ប្រជា
very
ជាតិ
principle
នោះឡើយ
enshrined in the
ហើយ
charters
អារម្មណ៍
of the United
ធាន
Nations. Excellencies, President.
កម្ពុជាពិតជាមានមោទនភាពណាស់
This
ក្នុងការ
coming
ធ្វើជាម្ចាស់
November,
ផ្ទះនៃកិច្ចប្រជុំកំ
Cambodia
ពូល
is
អាស៊ីអឺរ៉ុប
proud to host
លើកទី
virtually
13 តាមប្រព័ន្ធវីដេអូ
13th summit
នៅក្នុងខែ
of
វិច្ឆិកា
the
ខាងមុខនេះ
Asia-Europe meeting,
ក្រោមមូលបត្រ
ASEM 13,
ការពង្រឹងពហុ
with a
ភាគី
theme
និយម
strengthening
ដើម្បីកំណើនរួម
multilateralism
ដែល
for shared
ជា
growth
ដែល
that
ជា
we
សារៈ
view today as still
សំខាន់នៅ
very
ក្នុងបរិបទ
important.
បច្ចុប្បន្ននេះតាមទស្សនៈរបស់ខ្ញុំរបៀប
In
វារៈ
my view,
ចម្បងនៃកិច្ច
the
ប្រជុំ
main
កំពូល
agenda
គឺពហុ
that
ភាគីនិយម
must dominate
ដល់
the
អត្ថភាព
summit
ដល់ការ
should
រួម
be
គ្នា
that multilateralism
ដែលមានជា
gives
ការរួម
priorities
គ្នាប្រយុទ្ធ
to
នឹងជំងឺ
convergence.
COVID-19
Convergence
និង
on the
ក
fight
សាងសង្គម
against
សេដ្ឋកិច្ច
COVID-19
ឲ្យមាន
and
ភាព
to
រឹង
build
មាំឡើង
back
វិញ
a
ការ
stronger
រួមគ្នា
society and
ប្រយុទ្ធនឹង
economy.
ការប្រែប្រួលអាកាសធាតុ
A
និង
convergence
ការកែតម្
on
រ
the
ង់
fight
អង្គការពាណិ
against
ជ្ជកម្មពិ
climate
ភពលោក
change.
ឡា
And on
ការ
key
ប្រែប្រួលអាកាស
proposal
ធាតុ
for
គឺជា
WHO
បញ្ហាប្រ
reform,
ឈមមួយ
among
ផ្សេងទៀត
others.
ដែលទាមទារឲ្យមាន
Climate
សកម្ម
change
ភាព
is
ជាសកល
another
ដែលមាន
impending
លក្ខណៈបន្ត
challenge
និង
that
ច្បាស់លាស់
require
នៅ
urgent
ក្នុង
and
នៅគ្រប់
concrete
ស្រទាប់
global action
នៅ
at
ក្នុង
all
បរិបទ
levels.
នេះកម្ពុជា
In
សូម
this
គាំទ្រ
context,
ការអំពាវនាវរបស់
Cambodia
ឯកឧត្តមអគ្គ
support
លេខា
the
ធិការ
Secretary General's
ចំពោះការបង្កើនការ
to
គាំទ្រ
scale
ដល់កិច្ច
up
ខិតខំ
support
ប្រឹងប្រែងបន្សាំ
for
ខ្លួន
regional
និងសម្
adaptation
រាលខ្លួន
and mitigation
សម្រាប់បន្
efforts
ទុកក្នុងតំបន់
and
និងសូម
reaffirm
បញ្ជាក់ជាថ្មីនៅការបដិ
our
ញ្ញាចិត្ត
commitment
ចំ
to
ពោះ
the
កិច្ចព្រម
Paris
ព្រៀងទីក្រុងប៉ារីស
Agreement
ស្របតាមគោ
in
លការណ៍
line with the
ជា
principle
បញ្ហា
of
រួម
common
ប៉ុន្តែអនុវត្តផ្សេងៗគ្នាទៅតាមការ
responsibilities.
ទទួលខុសត្រូវនិងសមត្ថកិច្ចរៀងៗខ្លួនឯកឧត្តមប្រធានសន្តិភាព
Excellencies
និង
President,
សន្តិសុខអន្តរជាតិមានសារៈ
international
សំខាន់
peace and security
សម្រាប់អ
are
នាគត
the
ប្រ
utmost
កបដោយចីរ
important
ភាព
for a
កម្
sustainable
ពុជាសូមបញ្
future.
ជាក់ជាថ្មីអំពី
Cambodia
ចំ
would
ហដែល
like
ប្រ
to
កាន់យកជា
reiterate
យូរមក
its
ហើយ
long-standing
ការ
position
ទទួលខុសត្រូវ
that the
ចំហ
primary
ក្នុងការថែរក្សា
responsibilities
សន្តិភាព
for
និង
the
សន្តិសុខអន្តរ
maintenance
ជាតិ
of
គឺ
internal
ស្ថិត
peace and
នៅលើអង្គការ
security
សហប្រជា
rest
ជាតិ
with the
ចាប់
United
តាំងពីឆ្នាំ
Nations.
2006 មកកម្ពុជាបានរួមចំណែក
2006
តាមរយៈការបញ្ជូនកង
Cambodia
កម្លាំង
has contributed
ជាង
more than
7,500 នាក់
7,500
ក្នុងពេល
troops
សកម្មរ
to
ក្សាសន្តិ
serve
ភាព
in
ផ្សេងៗ
various
នៅ
UN
ទូទាំងពិភពលោក
peacekeeping missions
របស់អង្គការ
across
សហប្រជា
the
ជាតិ
globe.
ហើយកងកម្លាំងរបស់
And
យើង
the
មួយ
numbers
ចំនួន
of our
បាន
troops
ធ្វើពលកម្ម
have made the
បូជាជីវិត
ultimate
ក្នុងអំឡុង
sacrifice
ពេលបំពេញ
during
ពេលស
their
កម្ម
mission
ការពារ
to
ជនស្
protect
រូតត្រង់
the innocent.
លើសពីនេះកម្ពុជាគាំទ្រដល់សកម្មភាពសម្រាប់
Cambodia support
គំ
the
និតធ្វើ
Secretary
តាមរក្សា
General's
សន្តិភាពបូក
action for
របស់ឯកឧត្តម
peacekeeping plus
អគ្គលេខាធិការ
A4P
កម្ព
plus
ូជាក៏គាំទ្ររបៀប
initiative.
វរៈស្ដីពីស្ត្រី
Cambodia
សន្តិ
also
ភាព
support
និងសន្តិសុ
the
ខ
women,
ដែលនឹង
peace
ធ្វើសម្បា
and
រណកម្មទស្ស
securities
នៈ
agenda
វិស័យ
which
gender
will have
ដ៏មាន
integrate
អត្ថន័យ
a
ទៅក្នុងប្រតិ
meaningful
បត្តិការ
gender
រក្សាសន្តិភាពនានា
perspective in various
ជាមួយគ្នានេះ
peacekeeping
ដែរ
operations.
ខ្ញុំសូមសង្កត់ធ្ងន់ថា
In addition,
ប្រែប្រួល
I would like to re-emphasize that
នៃសតវត្ស
the
ទី
changing
21
realities of
នៅ
the
អង្គការសហប្រជាជាតិ
21st century
មួយដែល
demand
មានទម្រង់
a
ថ្មី
newly revamped
និងមានភាព
and
រហ័សរហួន
responsive United
ក្នុងការ
Nations.
ឆ្លើយតបអង្គការនេះ
The
ត្រូវតែប្រ
organization
កាន់ឲ្យបានជាប់
require a more
ជួត
democratic,
ជាងមុននៅអភិ
inclusive
ក្រមដោះស្រាយបញ្ហា
and
តាមបែបប្រជា
representative
ធិបតេយ្យ
approach
ប្រកប
to
ដោ
the
យបរិយា
problem
បន្ននិងភាព
of the
ជា
day.
រំលាយក្នុងន័យនេះ
this light,
កម្ពុជាសូមសម្ដែងនូវការគាំទ្រពេញទំហឹងចំពោះកិច្ចខិតខំប្រឹងប្រែងប្រកបដោយភាពបរិសុទ្ធរបស់ឯកឧត្តមអគ្គលេខាធិការការរៀបចំអង្គការនេះឲ្យកាន់តែមានភាពឆ្លើយតបទៅនឹងតម្រូវការរបស់ប្រទេសជាសមាជិកទំនាក់ទំនងរវាងក្រុមប្រឹក្សាសន្តិសុខ
the General Assembly and the United Nations Secretariat must also be reinvigorated. In this regard, Cambodia wishes to reaffirm its support for the Security Council reform. We are of the view that the foremost priority should be given to increasing the representation of developing countries, which comprise the vast majorities of member states. Excellencies, President, as the coming chair of ASEAN next year, Cambodia will seek to address the common challenges facing our region with a strong solidarity from ASEAN member states and the support of its external partners. Cambodia will aim to further advance the ASEAN community building process and to sustain ASEAN as a region of critical importance for global trade, investment, and supply chain. Cambodia will continue to push for a more vibrant and harmonious ASEAN community with better protection of migrant workers, a greener and more inclusive development agenda, and a more advanced digital transformation for MSMEs, women, and youth entrepreneurship. May I conclude by expressing my strong hope for a strengthened multilateralism with the United Nations at the core, to galvanize international solidarity for the global community to succeed in overcoming the COVID-19 crisis, advancing peace, sustainable development, and shared prosperity for all. Multilateralism is our hope, and we look to the United Nations as our beacon of hope. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre du Royaume du Cambodge pour l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. Et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant des Fidji pour qu'il introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Mr. President, I'm deeply honored to introduce Fiji's Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister for E-Toke Affairs, and Minister for Sugar and Forestry, Honorable Josiah Bainimarama, to address the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly through a pre-recorded message. I thank you.
The President of the 76th session of UN General Assembly, Abdullah Shahid, Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Bula Binaka from Fiji. Excellencies, I've just stepped away from a session in our parliament, the beating heart of our 8-year-old true parliamentary democracy. I wish I could be with you in New York, but I'm beholden to Fiji's shores to lead our COVID-19 response. Allow me to first congratulate you, Your Excellency Abdullah Shahid, on your election as the President of the General Assembly. The Fijian people, the stewards of 1.3 million square kilometers of blue Pacific, are proud to see the Maldives, another large ocean state, offer presidency to the international community. And to my friend, Secretary General Guterres, congratulations on your second term. Your re-election was a win for the planet, for the climate, and for the smaller states among us. Our multilateral challenges UN 2.0. Your report to the UNGA on our common agenda is the blueprint for a future that is better, greener, and safer. And I would humbly add, bluer. We want that future for Fiji. We want islands inhabited by citizens who stand with nature and not against it. We want sustainable economic growth that is powered by clean energy and protected from the impacts of climate change. We want robust and resilient health systems, and we want good jobs and income supported by a green and blue economy. To succeed, our vision must become the vision of humanity, because our fate is the world's fate. The world's present course leads nowhere near the future we want for ourselves. A deadly pathogen is burning through humanity like a bushfire, and inequity is fanning the flames. This year alone, climate-driven floods, heat waves, fires, and cyclones have killed hundreds and inflicted unsustainable economic damage. We humans are the cause, but we are refusing to become the solution. This grave moment is not without parallel. In the wake of the death and destruction of World War II, world leaders saw unilateral action as kindling for another world war, one fought with nuclear weapons of planet-destroying potential. They answered that challenge with the genius of this multilateral system. Our challenges are different, but the stakes are alike. Mr. Secretary General, your recommendations in our common agenda are spot on. We must meet this moment with a new UN, a new energy, new resources, and new bonds of trust with the people this institution serves. A new UN that enlists the dynamism of young people, because our action and inaction directly affects their future. A new UN that empowers those on the margins of society, particularly women and girls, and brings them into the center of global decision-making. Excellencies, since we last gathered, it has become clear that we face two pandemics, one that is ending for the wealthy nations and one that is worsening across much of the developing world. That widening chasm can be measured in lives lost and years of economic progress undone. Across the global south, what the world once branded as sustainable development is unraveling before our eyes. Hundreds of millions of jobs have been lost. Hundreds of millions of people cannot access adequate food, and an entire generation has had their education disrupted. The wounds of this crisis will cripple us for years if left untreated. Fiji's experience shows how an equitable recovery can begin. It starts by getting jabs in arms fast. After one full year with zero local COVID cases, the insidious Delta variant crept into our country and sparked a deadly second outbreak. After a slow start, while we scrambled to acquire enough vaccines, we are winning the battle. Over 98% of adults across our 110 populated islands have one jab of the vaccine, and more than 67% are fully vaccinated. We thank India, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States for helping us secure the doses we need. Our mission now is to recover the more than 100,000 jobs lost to the pandemic and to recoup a 50% loss in government revenues. Soon, Fiji will reopen to tourism and to regional and international business. We will look to accelerate investment trends, like increased digitization, that will modernize our economy and help it recover. But Fiji's victory over the virus will be short-lived unless the global community can accelerate vaccinations everywhere. It is appalling that wealthier countries are already considering third doses or boosters for their citizens, while millions of people, including frontline healthcare workers in the developing world, cannot access a single dose. Globally, thousands of lives are still being lost every day to the virus. the majority represent our collective failure to make vaccines available to developing countries. Vaccine nationalism must end. The G7, G20, and multilateral financial institutions have failed to stop it. Only the UN can fill this void of leadership. I join other leaders in calling on the UN to convene an urgent special meeting of leaders to agree to a time-bound, costed, and detailed plan for the full vaccination of developing countries. Our socio-economic challenge. Vaccine inequity is a symptom of a much larger injustice, one that is inherent to the international economic system. This injustice is the unequal distribution of finance or access to finance that can fuel a recovery. While wealthy nations have propped up their economies by printing and investing trillions at near zero interest rates, developing nations, particularly small states, have had to borrow at punitive rates to simply keep our people alive, fed and healthy. Through the pandemic, my government rolled out the largest cash transfer program in our history, providing hundreds of millions of dollars in unemployment benefits to nearly 1/3 of Fiji's adult population. We even expanded some of our social protection programs, including pensions for the elderly and financial support for the differently abled and other vulnerable communities. The alternative was mass destitution, which we could not accept. But to pay for it, we had to take on debt, precipitated by a massive reduction in government revenue. We need a more innovative framework for development finance that recognizes the unique needs of small island developing states. And we must adopt a more sophisticated framework of assessing debt sustainability that incorporates the urgency of building resilience and breaks free of the norms of the 20th century. This pandemic has been a painful lesson about where unilateral action can lead and where our multilateral institutions are unwilling to go. We must find new frontiers of cooperation if we stand any chance of averting future pandemics or staving off the worst of climate change. If small states are to build back greener, bluer, and better, we will need an equal voice about and vote on decisions that determine our future. Small states need our interests heard, understood, and acted upon. Now, our climate change, despite all the talk we hear of saving the planet, the world's collective commitments are paltry, akin to spitting into the strengthening winds of climate-fueled superstorms. The climate is on track for 2.7 degrees Celsius of global warming, which would ensure the loss of entire low-lying nations in the Pacific and huge chunks of global coastline. It guarantees frequent devastations from floods, from cyclones, coastal inundations, and wildfires. It spells climate-driven conflict, mass migration, and the collapse of food systems and ecosystems. It is appalling. It is unimaginable, but it is where we are headed. Since March 2020, Fiji has experienced 3 cyclones, 2 of which approach Category 5 intensity. Fijians are strong people. We endured much, and we will endure more still. But I'm tired of applauding my people's resilience. True resilience is not just defined by our nation's grit, but by our access to financial resources. Resilience is seawalls. It is parametric insurance for those most vulnerable. It is nature-based solutions. It is systematically relocating communities from the rising seas. Fiji is using every fiscal tool in our kit to do these things, and we are doing everything within our means to reduce our emissions. We have submitted an NDC that commits Fiji to net zero emissions and harnesses nature to lead that transition. Commitments that will soon become law through a comprehensive climate change bill. In recognition of the Ocean Climate Nexus, Fiji hopes to secure a blue bond next year in support of a sustainable blue Fijian economy. But Fiji can't halt climate change by itself. Today, small island development states are able to access less than 2% of the available climate finance. To build a truly resilient Fiji, we need access to fast-deploying targeted grants, long-term concessionary financing, and financial tools and instruments established through public-private collaborations and partnership. In our Oceans Challenge, the Fijian economy depends on a healthy ocean, and so we are taking bold strides to reverse its current decline. We have committed to 100% sustainable management of EEZ and 30% declared as marine protected areas by 2030. We are expanding investments in sustainable aquaculture, seaweed farming, and high-value processed fish. But we cannot do this alone. We look to the global system to stop illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. We look to member states to agree a new treaty to preserve marine in waters beyond national jurisdictions. We need global greenhouse gas emissions to fall dramatically and quickly. At COP26, we expect the ocean's pathway will be locked into the UNFCCC processes. Fiji seeks a decision in a 1/COP26 reflecting this change. Our COP26 package. In 1 month, Excellencies, we meet in Scotland for a hugely consequential COP. The Pacific's mission in Glasgow is clear. We must keep the 1.5 target alive. This demands drastic emissions cuts by 2030 that put large nations on a path towards net zero emissions before 2050. Leaders who cannot summon the courage to unveil these commitments and policy packages at COP26 should not bother booking a flight to Glasgow. Instead, they and the self-interest they stand for should face consequences that match the severity of what they are unleashing on our planet. We do not tolerate war between our member states. So how can we tolerate war waged against the planet, on the life it sustains, and on future generations? That is the firm red line Pacific nations will draw in Glasgow. We are demanding net zero emissions and accepting zero excuses. And Excellencies, at COP26, the global North must finally deliver on $100 billion per year in climate finance and agree to a pathway to increase financing commitments to at least $750 billion per year from 2025 forward. If we can spend trillions on missiles, drones, and nuclear submarines, we can fund climate action. It is criminal that vulnerable Pacific small island developing states can access a mere 0.05% of the climate finance currently available to protect ourselves from an existential crisis we did not cause. Mr. President, these are the challenges we face at this UNGA and at COP26. We must find the courage to face them squarely. The consequences of not doing so are simply unthinkable. We will see you in Glasgow. Thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre et ministre des questions Itoukei, de l'industrie sucrière et des affaires étrangères de la République des Fidji pour l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. Et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante du Bhoutan pour qu'elle introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have the honor and great privilege to introduce the pre-recorded video message from the Honorable Prime Minister of Bhutan, Dr. Lote Tsering.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, I bring you warm greetings from His Majesty the King, Her Majesty the Queen, and people of Bhutan, the land of gross national happiness. I begin with prayers for all the precious lives lost to the pandemic, and I sincerely hope it comes to an end very soon. Congratulations, Your Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for your presidentship. I assure you my full support as you assume this role at a very critical time. I also extend my gratitude to the 75th President for conducting the last session successfully. I take this opportunity to congratulate Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, on your re-election as the Secretary General of the United Nations. Nobody else can give us better hope and guidance to build back better from the pandemic than Your Excellency. I would also like to thank Your Excellency as well as Prime Minister Johnson for organizing the Leaders' Roundtable on climate change 5 days ago. I spoke on behalf of 46 LDCs, and we are already excited for a concrete result coming out of COP26 in the coming month. I would like to inform the August gathering that this year marks the 50th anniversary of Bhutan's membership to the UN. I was excited to attend the session and celebrate the milestones with you all, but the situation, as you all know, did not favor our physical participation. I thank everyone at the organization and all the members for enriching Bhutan's 5 decades of journey with the UN. We have come a long way. The fact that we are ready to graduate from LDC category is a clear indication that our efforts together have borne results. In addition to the UN and other partners, I thank the Government of India for your unconditional support all these years. We will continue to work closely with all the partners. Please allow me to talk a little more on this 5 decades journey. During the 50 years, the global poverty rate dropped from 52 to 9%. Life expectancy increased from 57 to almost 73 years. Bhutan's life expectancy at birth when we joined the UN in 1971 was just 40 years. The infant mortality rate decreased from 98 to 27 deaths per 1,000 live births. Similarly, the maternal mortality rate reduced from almost 400 to 200 deaths per 100,000 live births. The global literacy rate spiked from 67 to 86%. Without the coordinated global efforts through the UN platform, these progresses would not have been possible, or worse, many nations would have slipped backwards. We are thankful that Bhutan has comparatively benefited more. In the last 50 years, Bhutan was blessed with 3 successive monarchs. It was His late Majesty the Third King who worked tirelessly to install Bhutan into the UN. It was a historic move to establish global diplomacy and harness meaningful friendship. The far-sighted monarch led the country on the path of modernization, with focus on modern education and progressive techniques in all spheres. When the 4th king took over soon after, he came in with a profound development philosophy of gross national happiness in as early as 1972. As the term GNH became more pronounced over the years, the world appreciated its relevance in a sustainable and more holistic format as opposed to the conventional GDP growth. I'm happy to see this concept reflected in Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report, which I would like to touch upon a little later. The nation lived through major socio-economic development, championing on conservation efforts and strengthening global ties. The world will recall that during the peak of his reign, our 4th king stepped down to offer the throne to his son, and despite public resistance, he ushered in democratic transition. Destined to carry forward the legacy, Bhutan received a young and dynamic monarch, His Majesty the King, in 2006. We embarked on a new chapter. Just under 2 decades, people of Bhutan relished the reign of a king who was caring, learned, and astute. For generations, Bhutanese have always loved and revered our kings for the simple reason that our monarchs have been selfless for the nation and the people. But when COVID crisis unfolded, for Bhutan, we uncovered the true essence of our king's leadership. In him, we saw a son who assured that the old and vulnerable people were protected from the infection. In him, we saw a brother who traveled tirelessly throughout the country, uplifting the spirits of the frontliners and working alongside to protect the people. In His Majesty, we saw a parent who ensured the livelihoods of all those affected. The supports ranged from emotional to cash to food. But of all, we saw a noble being who led with science and wisdom on one hand and care and compassion on the other. Complementing all the noble efforts, Her Majesty the Queen showed personal care and initiated targeted interventions for the vulnerable sections of our society, with emphasis on mental health care and services in the country. When the world was dealing with the unprecedented plight that questioned our survival and livelihood daily, we sailed through with a minimum scratch from the pandemic. To update, we have seen only 3 COVID deaths and slightly over 2,500 cases so far, most of which were imported cases. Similarly, our vaccination coverage for 12-year-old and above is almost 80% as I speak today. Despite being resource constrained, we have not compromised on the quality and standards of COVID measures. Let me also mention that in the entire process of battling the pandemic, we ensured that the routine health services were delivered uninterrupted. Besides the regular vaccination program, we introduced HPV vaccines for the first time for all the boys and introduced flu shots for everyone amid the pandemic. We also launched a nationwide program on prevention and early detection of 3 most common cancers in Bhutan. Those are stomach, breast, and cervical cancers. All these are aligned with the royal visions that is enshrined in our constitution that mandates a state to provide free health and education. His Majesty tells us that quality health and education made affordable and available to all are the biggest social levelers. Excellencies, just like the rest of the world, we are also looking at the pandemic as an opportunity to reset ourselves. The process to overhaul the civil service in consonance with the educational reform is underway. This is an unprecedented move. A nationwide rollout of the Bhutan baccalaureate system is in progress following the successful trial of a formative education system in the last 10 years. Knowing that the path ahead is ICT-driven, we have started digital initiatives with the ultimate goal for everyone in Bhutan to have a digital ID, a build-up towards a big data system. Some other components are ICTization of the schools, integrated taxation system, and electronic patient information management. On the other hand, our central bank is also piloting a project on digital miltram, Bhutan's currency, using blockchain technology. This is to adapt with the overall ICT transformation and harness technology of a 21st century Bhutan. Here, let me share that it is as though His Majesty saw the pandemic coming. In 2011, an extensive program that engaged citizens in a greater role of nation building, calling it Desung, the Guardian of Peace, was started. It recharged the entire spirit of volunteerism, opened the world of opportunities for our young youth, and injected sense of purpose and responsibility. Thousands of youth were involved in the program that created a mass societal shift. When the disease entered the country, the Desups in their orange uniform were helping guard the borders and entry points, ensuring everyone followed COVID-19 norms and even became part of the paramedics. This made a huge impact in efficient management of the pandemic. In another unique transformative step, the Desups, when not part of COVID-19 related duties, were engaged in various skillings and reskilling programs across the nation. We know that the pandemic has forced many out of their jobs and their basic skills have become irrelevant. The ILO projects the global shortfall of jobs to be about 75 million this year and almost 23 million in the year 2022. This means unless we retool ourselves in keeping with the change, it will be difficult to find gainful employment and other opportunities for many of us. The ongoing youth engagement programs are the major steps to recover from the pandemic. While the effects may not be immediate, down the years, it would have been one of the main reasons for us to come out of the pandemic stronger. I feel when Bhutan's socio-economic transformation is reviewed later, our human development initiatives guided by our King will be the chapter that would have truly steered our nation into the 21st century. I am highly appreciative of the fact that the UN instruments are sensitive in picking this up. A special recognition was awarded to His Majesty for his leadership in advancing human development and well-being of Bhutanese people in 2019. Excellencies, we have immense lessons to draw from the pandemic. be it at national or global level. It has uncovered weaknesses and potentials of many nations and societies. But one lesson that we all must keep in mind is to be prepared with a more resilient system for future. The nomenclature of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 clearly indicates that there will be successive outbreaks of infectious diseases. It is a matter of when. I mean, nobody knows where SARS-CoV-3 is getting incubated. Therefore, our focus to build back better can never be good if we don't emphasize on health and quality of healthcare that must be easily accessible and affordable by everyone. We must also be mindful that immediate disease outbreak could be potentially from the pandemic-induced starvation and poverty. The pandemic has disrupted the already weak global food system. The Asia-Pacific region alone has almost 90 million people pushed back into extreme poverty in the aftermath of the current health crisis. I shared my concern during the UN Food System Summit the day before. Forget meeting the nutritional requirements. We are struggling to ensure adequate quantity. We must coordinate clear action plans to meet the immediate food shortage and long-term sustenance plan. In all the discussions on food security, one immediate challenge besides the pandemic is the climate change that has tested the resilience of the food we grow as well as the patience of the growers, which is why it is time for action now. On Bhutan's part, our visionary monarchs have maintained very high legal standards to safeguard our natural heritage. We have a dedicated chapter on environment in our constitution, which mandates 60% forest cover at all times to come and maintain intergenerational equity of our natural resources. We have more than half the country as protected areas. In order to safeguard the health of the protected areas and livelihood of the people living there, a royal charter was issued on an innovative funding mechanism called Bhutan for Life. We consider these as our eternal NDCs from Bhutan. If we mean what we say about working for the next generation, we must talk about tough climate laws as a component of NDCs from all other countries. Excellencies, despite being a small developing nation, as a GNH country, we always believed in global peace and harmony. Bhutan joined the peacekeeping fraternity in 2014. Since then, our involvement with UN peacekeeping has grown. We are now set to deploy a Bhutanese Quick Reaction Force for the first time this year. I thank the UN for trusting us. I'm confident that our troops will live up to His Majesty's aspirations of serving with distinction and honor. In conclusion, we all know that COVID-19 will leave behind a different world, but what sort of a world we want lies in our hands. Mr. Secretary General's report titled Our Common Agenda offers all of us a good reference point for our collective progress. For this, I thank the Secretary General for coming out with this comprehensive and bold report on a greener and safer world. Please know that Bhutan is committed to working with other member states in advancing the ideas in the report. We have full confidence in your leadership